Welcome, dear listener, to another journey into the forgotten corners of history. I hope this finds you in a comfortable place, perhaps settling in for the night, ready to let the weight of the day gradually slip away. Before we begin, I wonder where you might be listening from tonight. Perhaps a bedroom in a house whose very structure owes more to Viking influence than you realise, or an apartment in a city whose street layout echoes medieval Scandinavian settlement patterns. Wherever you are, thank you for choosing to spend this time exploring the invisible threads that connect us to a world we think we've left behind. If you enjoy these gentle explorations of history's uncomfortable truths, you might consider subscribing to join us on future journeys into the past. Tonight we turn our attention to something both fascinating and unsettling: the rules, customs and assumptions that govern our daily lives without our conscious awareness. Social conventions we follow religiously despite having no idea why we do so. We toast at celebrations, shake hands in greeting, knock on wood for luck, and structure our weeks around days named for gods we don't worship. These aren't random quirks of modern culture. They are quite literally Viking rules, social technologies developed over 1,000 years ago in the harsh lands of Scandinavia, designed to solve problems we no longer face. Yet we continue to follow them with the devotion of the most faithful believer. Picture, if you will, a world where every social interaction carried the potential for sudden violence. The Scandinavian lands from roughly 800 to 1100 CE were not the romantic realm of noble warriors that popular culture would have you believe. They were instead a patchwork of small communities separated by dense forests, treacherous seas, and weeks of travel, where the absence of centralised authority meant that every handshake might be a trap, every feast might end in bloodshed, every stranger might be your killer. In this world of chronic uncertainty and ambient threat, the Vikings developed an elaborate system of social rules designed to prevent violence, signal intentions, and create predictable patterns in an unpredictable world. These rules worked remarkably well. So well, in fact, that they spread throughout Europe with Viking trade, conquest and settlement. So well that they embedded themselves into languages, legal systems and cultural practices across the Western world. So well that we continue to follow them today, over 1,000 years later, in a world that bears almost no resemblance to the one that created them. We shake hands because Viking warriors needed a way to prove they weren't reaching for a weapon. We structure our weeks around days named for Norse gods because Christian missionaries found it easier to repurpose existing calendar systems than to create new ones. We knock on wood because ancient Scandinavians believed trees house protective spirits. These aren't charming historical quirks. They are the fossilised remains of a culture built around the constant threat of death, and we move through our modern lives unconsciously obeying rules designed for a world of axes and blood feuds, never stopping to ask why. Let us begin with something so fundamental that most people never think to question it: the 7-day week itself and the names we give to its days. This structure feels so natural, so inevitable, that it seems almost cosmic, as though the universe itself ordained that time should flow in these particular 7-day cycles with these particular names. It did not. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. These are not neutral descriptors, but rather a weekly ritual of unknowing worship, a 7-day prayer cycle to gods whose stories most people could not recount if asked. Picture, if you will, a Viking farmer in 9th century Norway waking before dawn on the day we call Wednesday. He does not think of it as the middle of the work week as we do. He thinks of it as Odin's Day, Wadensdag in the Old English that would eventually become our modern word. This is the day sacred to the All-Father, the one-eyed god of wisdom, war and death. The farmer makes a small offering at his household shrine, perhaps a bit of bread or ale, asking for Odin's favour in his work. It is not mere superstition to him. It is practical religion, a transaction with the forces that govern his world, undertaken on the day when that particular god's power is strongest. His week revolves around these divine associations, each day carrying its own character, its own requirements, its own dangers. The structure provides rhythm and meaning to time's passage, transforming the endless flow of days into a comprehensible pattern. Tuesday is Tyr's Day, named for the god of single combat and honourable warfare. Wednesday is Odin's, as we've seen. Thursday belongs to Thor, the thunder god and protector of common folk. Friday is Freya's, goddess of love, fertility and magic. Even Sunday and Monday, though later Christianized, originated in pre-Christian worship. Sunday for the sun, Monday for the moon. Our week is a Viking prayer calendar that we recite without realizing it. Every time you say, "See you Thursday," you are quite literally invoking Thor. The Vikings needed this structure because, in their world of oral tradition and limited literacy, time itself had to be embedded in story and ritual to be remembered and coordinated across communities. They couldn't send calendar invites or check their phones. They needed the days themselves to carry meaning, to be distinctive enough that everyone could remember what day it was and what was supposed to happen on it. The religious associations served this practical purpose, while simultaneously reinforcing the social order and shared belief system. It was an elegant solution to the problem of coordinating human activity across space and time without writing. But here is what's haunting about it. We no longer need this solution, yet we cannot escape it. The 7-day week has no astronomical basis, no foundation in natural cycles that would make it inevitable. Months roughly follow the moon, years follow the sun, but the week is purely cultural, purely arbitrary. Many civilizations used different lengths. The ancient Egyptians had 10-day weeks. The French Revolution briefly imposed a 10-day week. The Soviet Union experimented with both 5-day and 6-day weeks. None of these caught on, not because 7 is objectively superior, but because Viking influence spread so thoroughly through European languages and culture that alternatives felt unnatural, wrong. So here we are, in a world of electric lights and digital calendars, still organising our time around the convenience of long-dead Scandinavian farmers and their pantheon of violent, capricious gods. We complain about Monday, never asking why the moon's day should be particularly difficult. We celebrate Friday, never acknowledging that we're honouring a goddess whose worship involved fertility rites that would make modern people deeply uncomfortable. We move through our weekly cycles like sleepwalkers, following a rhythm set by people who thought thunder was caused by a god riding his chariot across the sky. Perhaps most disturbing of all is what this reveals about cultural persistence. Given enough time and repetition, any arbitrary structure becomes invisible, unquestionable, sacred even to those who no longer remember why it exists. Now let us turn to a gesture so universal in Western culture that its absence is remarked upon and judged: the handshake. When two people meet for the first time in a business context, at a job interview, at a formal introduction, they extend their right hands and grasp each other, moving their joined hands up and down in a motion that, when you really think about it, serves no practical purpose whatsoever. We teach children that a good handshake should be firm but not crushing, that eye contact should be maintained, that the gesture conveys trustworthiness and confidence. An entire mythology has grown around this peculiar practice, with business etiquette guides devoting pages to the proper technique. A weak handshake, we're told, suggests weakness of character. An overly aggressive handshake suggests compensation for inadequacy. The perfect handshake somehow reveals inner virtue. None of this is natural or inevitable. It is Viking engineering, designed for a very specific problem that no longer exists. Imagine a meeting between two Viking chieftains at a neutral location, perhaps a thing, one of the outdoor assemblies where disputes were settled and alliances forged. Both men are armed, probably with swords on their left hips, accessible to their right hands for quick drawing. Both men are surrounded by armed retainers who will slaughter the other party at the first sign of treachery. The tension is extraordinary. One wrong move, one perceived insult, and dozens of people die. These men need to negotiate, to come to agreements, to forge alliances or settle disputes. But first they must overcome the immediate tactical problem. How do you get close enough to someone to talk when both of you are armed and afraid? The solution is brilliant in its simplicity. Both men extend their right hands, their weapon hands, and grasp each other. This accomplishes several critical things simultaneously. First, it demonstrates that neither is reaching for a weapon. The right hand is occupied, neutralized, visible. Second, it allows each man to feel the other's grip, to assess strength and intent through physical contact. A trembling hand might betray fear or deception. A steady grip suggests confidence and honest intent. Third, the physical closeness created by the handshake puts both men at equal risk. If one tries to draw a weapon with his left hand, the other can do the same, and they'll both likely die in the resulting melee. It's a mutual disarmament through mutual vulnerability. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, it creates a physical connection that is difficult to break suddenly. If you're shaking someone's hand, you cannot immediately stab them. There's a lag time, a moment of separation required before violence becomes possible. This gives both parties a chance to disengage if the conversation turns hostile, or for retainers to intervene, or for cooler heads to prevail. The handshake is, in essence, a miniature peace treaty, a temporary cessation of hostilities encoded in physical gesture. It worked remarkably well, so well that it spread throughout medieval Europe, becoming the standard greeting between armed men, so well that it persisted even after swords stopped being daily carry items, so well that it eventually became the default professional greeting in cultures whose members have never seen combat and carry no weapons. We continue to extend our right hands and grasp strangers, creating momentary vulnerability and physical connection, because our ancestors needed a way to negotiate without immediately killing each other. But here's what should unsettle you. We still judge people based on this gesture designed for a world of endemic violence. A job candidate with a weak handshake is less likely to be hired, not because the weakness of their grip has any bearing on their ability to do the job, but because some part of us still associates that weakness with the original context. Lack of martial capacity, potential untrustworthiness in situations of physical threat. We're unconsciously screening office workers for their suitability as Viking Age warriors. Women, who are not the primary users of this gesture in its original context, are often penalised in modern professional contexts for not conforming to a handshake standard developed by and for armed men. The proper handshake is, essentially, a demonstration of controlled aggression, of the capacity for violence held in check by social convention. This made perfect sense when the people shaking hands actually were violent and needed to prove their control. It makes considerably less sense when the people shaking hands are accountants who have never thrown a punch. Yet we persist, generation after generation, teaching children to grip firmly, to make eye contact, to perform this ritual of controlled threat, never explaining that they're learning the greeting protocol of people who wore swords to business meetings. Consider now the wedding ring, that circle of metal whose placement on the fourth finger of the left hand is treated as sacrosanct across much of the Western world. The tradition feels ancient, eternal, obviously correct. Brides and grooms exchange these circles during ceremonies that vary wildly in other respects, but almost universally include this particular gesture, the placement of a ring on that specific finger. Most people, if asked, might mumble something about the ancient Egyptians or Romans, about a vein that supposedly runs from that finger directly to the heart, about the circle representing eternal love. These explanations are half-remembered fragments, partly true but missing the darker context that makes the practice make sense. The Vikings had a very different understanding of what a wedding ring represented, and it's their understanding, not the romantic version, that actually explains why we still follow this rule. Picture a young woman in 10th century Iceland, perhaps 16 years old, being prepared for her wedding day. The ceremony she's about to undergo is not primarily about love, though love might develop. It's about property transfer, alliance formation, and the production of legitimate heirs. Her father and her husband-to-be have negotiated a bride price and a dowry. Agreements have been made about land rights, inheritance, and the division of any future children. She is, in the most literal sense, being exchanged between men as part of a property transaction. The ring that will be placed on her finger during the ceremony serves as a receipt, a proof of purchase, a physical marker that she is now the property of her husband's household. The choice of the fourth finger of the left hand is not arbitrary. In Norse belief, this finger was thought to have a direct connection to the heart. Yes, but the significance of this connection was not romantic. It was magical and binding. A ring placed on this finger was believed to have power over the wearer's loyalty and affection, literally binding their heart to their spouse through supernatural means. It was, in effect, a magical restraint, ensuring that the woman could not easily transfer her loyalties elsewhere or leave the marriage. The ring was not just a symbol, but a working enchantment, as real and practical to the Vikings as a modern prenuptial agreement is to us. The man typically did not wear a ring, or wore a less significant one, because the binding was not mutual. He was the owner, not the owned. She was the one whose heart needed to be magically restrained. The double ring ceremony, where both partners exchange rings, is a much later development, an attempt to make the tradition feel more egalitarian without actually changing its fundamental meaning. We've tried to smooth over the uncomfortable origins by making it mutual, by draping it in language about equal partnership and shared commitment, but the gesture itself remains unchanged. A circle of metal placed on a specific finger during a ceremony that legally binds two people together. The practice spread throughout Europe, along with Viking settlement and influence, merging with similar Roman traditions to become nearly universal in Western culture. By the medieval period, canon law specified that the wedding ring should be placed on the fourth finger of the left hand, codifying what had been Viking magical practice into Christian religious requirement. The tradition persisted through centuries, long after anyone remembered why this particular finger was significant, long after the magical beliefs that made it make sense had been forgotten or suppressed. Today, we continue this practice with an almost religious devotion. A wedding ring on the wrong finger is instantly noticeable and wrong-feeling. People who lose their wedding rings experience genuine distress, feeling somehow incomplete or improperly married without this circle of metal on this specific finger. We've invested the gesture with such meaning that it overshadows nearly everything else about marriage. You can have a wedding in a courthouse wearing jeans, you can skip the ceremony entirely and just file paperwork, but if you're married, the assumption is that you're wearing a ring on that finger. Otherwise, how will people know you're bound? But here is the haunting part. We're still performing a ritual designed to magically restrain women's hearts, still marking ownership with precious metal, still following rules about which finger and which hand that made sense only in a context of marriage as property exchange and magical binding. We've changed the story we tell about it, wrapped it in romance and equality, but the gesture itself is unchanged, and gestures carry their history whether we acknowledge it or not. Every time someone looks down at their wedding ring and feels that sense of connection and commitment, they're feeling what the Vikings designed them to feel, that they are bound, marked, claimed. The magic may not be literal anymore, but the psychological effect is the same, and that might be more unsettling than any spell. Let us now examine a social ritual so embedded in Western culture that its absence would be remarkable, the practice of toasting before drinking, of raising glasses and making a verbal pronouncement before consuming alcohol in a group setting. Cheers, we say, or salud, or skål, that last being a direct borrowing from Old Norse. We clink our glasses together, we wait until everyone has participated before drinking. We treat this moment as somehow sacred or at least significant. The person who drinks before the toast is committed is considered rude, borderline offensive, violating an unspoken rule that nearly everyone follows without understanding. This is not a neutral social nicety. It is a Viking poison detection protocol that we continue to perform, despite no longer facing the threat it was designed to address. Imagine a feast in a Viking longhouse, perhaps celebrating a successful raid or sealing a political alliance. The hall is crowded with warriors, jarls, and visiting dignitaries. Everyone is armed, everyone is at least somewhat drunk. Many of the people present have blood feuds with others in the room, debts of honour that demand violent repayment, grudges that have simmered for years. The social pressure to maintain peace during the feast is strong. Violating guest right, killing someone during a celebration in your own hall, is a profound taboo that brings supernatural punishment and social ruin. But poison? Poison is different. Poison allows you to kill your enemy while maintaining plausible deniability, while technically keeping your hands clean. The Vikings were not naive about this. They knew that any cup might contain death, that any moment of inattention could be fatal, so they developed a comprehensive system for drinking safely in hostile company. The toast ritual served multiple purposes. First, when the host raised his drinking horn and made a pronouncement, typically an invocation of the gods or a statement of intent, everyone in the hall had to pay attention. All eyes were on the speaker. This made it much harder for someone to slip poison into a cup while attention was elsewhere. Second, the actual toasting formula often involved swearing oaths by the gods, calling down divine witness and punishment on anyone who violated the peace of the feast. This added supernatural deterrence to the social pressure. Third, and most practically, the host drank first from his own cup, in full view of everyone. This demonstrated that the drink was safe, that he was not trying to poison his guests. Only after the host had drunk would others drink, and they would drink more or less simultaneously, making it difficult for anyone to poison specific cups. The clinking of drinking vessels together, which seems like pointless ceremony to us, had a very specific purpose. It caused liquid to splash from one cup to another, mixing the contents. If your drink was poisoned but mine was not, the mixing would dilute your poison while potentially exposing me to it. This created a mutual vulnerability, a shared fate. If you poisoned my drink, the clinking would poison yours too. It was yet another example of Viking social technology creating safety through mutual risk. The word skål itself comes from the Old Norse skål, meaning bowl, because the earliest versions of this ritual involved passing a single bowl around the circle, with each person drinking from the same vessel. If it was poisoned, everyone died. If it wasn't, everyone lived. The shared bowl created absolute certainty. The host couldn't poison his guests without poisoning himself, and guests couldn't poison each other without dying together. As individual cups became more common, the ritual adapted, but the core principle remained: drink together, drink simultaneously, and ensure through ritual and attention that everyone is consuming the same safe substance. This practice spread throughout medieval Europe and persisted long after poisoning at feast became rare. By the early modern period, people were still toasting and clinking glasses but had largely forgotten why, attributing it to good manners or superstition about sharing good fortune. The ritual had become disconnected from its function, transformed into pure social performance. And yet we continue, raising our glasses in bars and restaurants, waiting for everyone to be ready, clinking our vessels together, saying words we've half forgotten the meaning of. We do this at weddings where no one present has any intention of poisoning anyone, at business dinners where the worst threat is probably food poisoning from poorly stored shellfish, at birthday parties for children who receive juice in plastic cups. The ritual persists in contexts where its original purpose is not just absent but absurd. Here's what should disturb you. We're so devoted to this meaningless routine that we actually judge people for violating it. The person who starts drinking before the toast feels wrong to us, rude, as though they've committed a genuine offence. We've internalised a poison detection protocol so thoroughly that it feels like basic decency, like respect for others, when what we're actually doing is performing a ritual designed for a world where your drinking companions might literally be trying to murder you. We toast in a world where the greatest risk is probably overindulgence, following rules designed for a world where every cup might be your last, and we never stop to ask why we're doing it, or what it reveals about how deeply the paranoia and violence of the past have shaped our present. Consider now one of the strangest things we do: knocking on wood. When someone mentions good fortune or expresses hope for the future, many people will immediately reach out to rap their knuckles against the nearest wooden surface. "I haven't been sick all year," someone says, and then, almost involuntarily, knock on wood, while tapping a table, a door frame, whatever is handy. If no wood is available, some people will knock on their own heads, treating this as an acceptable substitute. We perform this ritual automatically, often with a self-deprecating laugh acknowledging its absurdity, yet we do it anyway, compelled by something deeper than rational thought. This is not a charming quirk of folk belief. It is a Viking, supernatural defense protocol, a method of communicating with the spirits that inhabit trees, asking them to maintain the protection they've been providing without realizing you are being protected. To understand why we still do this, we need to understand the Viking relationship with trees, which was complex, reverent, and deeply magical. Picture an ancient forest in pre-Christian Scandinavia, the kind of old-growth woodland that covered much of northern Europe before agriculture cleared it. These were not the tame, managed forests we know today. These were dense, dark places where the oldest trees had stood for centuries, their roots deep in earth that held the bones of countless forgotten dead. To the Vikings, these trees were not simply plants. They were beings, houses for landvetir, land spirits who had claimed the territory long before humans arrived. These spirits were not benevolent in any Christian sense. They were neutral, transactional, potentially hostile if offended. They could bring good fortune to those who honoured them and disaster to those who didn't. Every tree, but especially the very old ones, might contain such a spirit, and disturbing these trees without proper acknowledgement could bring terrible consequences. The practice of knocking on wood originated as a way of alerting the tree spirit to your presence and your intentions. Before cutting a tree for timber, a Viking would knock on its trunk and speak to the spirit inside, explaining the necessity, offering thanks, sometimes leaving a small gift. This wasn't superstition to them. It was practical magical hygiene, as sensible as washing your hands before eating. If you didn't properly acknowledge the spirit, the wood from that tree might bring bad luck to whatever you built with it. Your house might burn down, your ship might sink, your family might sicken. All because you failed to knock and ask permission. The practice extended beyond tree cutting. Vikings would knock on wooden objects in their homes as a way of maintaining good relations with the spirits inhabiting the wood. Remember that Viking houses were built almost entirely of wood. The walls, the floors, the roof beams, the furniture. Living in a wooden house meant living inside what had been trees, and those trees might still contain fragments of their original spirits. Knocking was a way of saying hello, of acknowledging the presence, of maintaining the relationship. When someone mentioned good fortune, the immediate impulse to knock on wood came from the belief that speaking of good fortune might attract the attention of malevolent spirits or jealous gods who would want to take that fortune away. The knock was a request to the protective tree spirits. "I've just announced my good health, which might attract hostile attention. Please continue protecting me from harm." It was magical insurance, a way of reinforcing the defensive perimeter that the tree spirits provided. This practice was so deeply embedded in Viking culture that it survived the conversion to Christianity, partially because the church found it easier to reframe existing practices than to eliminate them. The tree spirits became less explicitly pagan, more like general forces of fortune, but the gesture remained identical. You knocked on wood not to commune with a landveet, but to ward off bad luck, a subtle shift in explanation that preserved the practice while removing its most obviously pagan elements. The tradition spread throughout Europe, carried by Norse settlement and influence, and persisted through centuries. By the modern era, most people who knocked on wood had no idea they were performing a pagan ritual, had no concept of tree spirits or Landvetter. They did it because their parents did it, because everyone did it, because not doing it felt wrong in a way they couldn't articulate. The practice became pure superstition, divorced from any coherent belief system, yet still compelling. And here we are, in a world of steel and plastic, in buildings that might not contain any actual wood, still knocking on tables made of pressed fiberboard, still performing a ritual designed to maintain good relations with the spirits inhabiting trees. We do this in office buildings where no tree has stood in a century. We do this while talking on phones, surrounded by technology that would seem like incomprehensible magic to the people who originated this practice. We do it despite not believing in tree spirits, despite knowing it's silly, despite having no coherent explanation for why we're doing it. Perhaps most disturbing is the compulsion itself. When someone mentions good fortune and doesn't knock on wood, many of us feel a surge of anxiety on their behalf, a sense that they've left themselves vulnerable by failing to perform the protective ritual. We've retained the emotional response, the feeling that the ritual is necessary, while losing any understanding of what we think we're protecting against. We're still trying to appease tree spirits we don't believe in, still performing offerings to gods we've forgotten, and the fact that we mock ourselves for doing it doesn't stop us from doing it. That's how deep these Viking rules have burrowed into our consciousness. We can recognise their absurdity and still be unable to resist them. Let us turn now to something so fundamental to English grammar that it seems like a feature of language itself rather than a cultural choice. The use of gender in pronouns and the asymmetrical way we refer to men and women. In English, we have he and she, him and her, his and hers. We have different titles for married and unmarried women, Miss and Mrs., while men get the universal Mr. regardless of marital status. We have different nouns for male and female versions of many roles and animals, actor and actress, waiter and waitress, stallion and mare. This gendering feels natural, inevitable, simply the way language works. It is not. It is a Viking linguistic system that embeds specific assumptions about gender hierarchy into every sentence we speak, making it nearly impossible to talk about people without unconsciously reinforcing rules about who matters more. The Old Norse language, which heavily influenced the development of English, had a complex gender system, but not in the way modern people usually think about it. Old Norse had 3 grammatical genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. But these were not particularly connected to biological sex. A table could be masculine, a knife could be feminine, a house could be neuter. The grammatical gender system was largely arbitrary. But when it came to people, the gender markers were anything but arbitrary. They encoded legal status, social power, and human worth. Picture a Viking Age assembly, a thing where legal disputes are being settled and community decisions are being made. Only free men who own property can speak. The term for such a man in Old Norse is Kalmada, literally man, emphasising his status as a full person, a complete human being with legal standing. The term for a woman is kona, but her legal status is fundamentally different. She cannot speak at the assembly. She cannot own property independently unless she is a widow. She cannot make legal contracts without a male guardian. In the language itself, the pronoun used for a woman is marked, special, different from the default, which is male. This is not a neutral grammatical feature. It is a direct encoding of power differential. The masculine pronoun is the universal, the default, the standard human. The feminine pronoun is the marked category, the deviation from the norm, the special case. This structure was built into Old Norse and, through Norse influence on English, became embedded in our language. Modern English inherited this asymmetry. When we don't know someone's gender, we've historically defaulted to he. When a student submits his work, if someone calls, tell him. The masculine as universal, the feminine as special case. We've started to challenge this in recent decades, but the underlying structure remains, and it shapes thought in ways we barely recognise. Research in cognitive linguistics has shown that gendered language affects how we think about the people and things being described. When a language marks women as a special category, separate from the default human, speakers of that language unconsciously think of women as more different, more other than they would if the language had a different structure. The Viking decision to make male the default and female the marked category wasn't random. It reflected and reinforced their social hierarchy, where women had significantly fewer legal rights and were literally classified as less than full persons under the law. The marital status markers, Miss and Mrs., come from this same tradition. A woman's title changed upon marriage because marriage changed her legal status and ownership. She went from being her father's property to her husband's property, and the language marked this transfer. An unmarried woman was a mistress, in the sense of being a master's daughter, under her father's authority. A married woman was a mistress in the sense of belonging to a household headed by her husband. Men never needed this distinction because men did not transfer ownership upon marriage. They remained full legal persons throughout their lives. Their title, master abbreviated to Mr., never changed because their fundamental status never changed. Even the terms we use for unmarried adults reveal this asymmetry. An unmarried man is a bachelor, a word with connotations of independence and freedom. An unmarried woman past a certain age is a spinster, a word that has acquired such negative connotations that it's barely usable anymore, or an old maid, which is even worse. The language itself judges women for being unmarried in ways it does not judge men, because in the Viking system that shaped these terms, an unmarried woman was a failure. She had not fulfilled her primary social function, which was to transfer from her father's household to her husband's, and produce legitimate heirs. These linguistic structures persist even as the legal realities have changed. We no longer have laws making women the property of their fathers or husbands, but we still have a language that was designed for that world, and language shapes thought more than we like to admit. Every time we use a gendered pronoun, every time we mark someone as Miss or Mrs., we're reinforcing categories that made sense only in a world of profound legal inequality. The recent push for gender-neutral language, using they as a singular pronoun, creating titles like memics, questioning why we gender so many roles and objects, is not political correctness run amok. It is the first serious attempt in centuries to challenge linguistic structures that the Vikings embedded in our language over 1,000 years ago. And the resistance to this change is telling. Many people feel that gender-neutral language is awkward, unnatural, wrong. But what feels natural is just what feels familiar, what we've been conditioned to accept. The Viking gendering system feels natural because we've been speaking it our entire lives, because our parents spoke it, because everyone around us speaks it. But natural and good are not the same thing, and the fact that something has been done for 1,000 years does not mean it should be done for 1,000 more. Consider now the way we name ourselves and our children, a practice that seems deeply personal and individual, but is actually highly constrained by rules we don't consciously acknowledge. In most Western cultures, people have a given name, often a middle name, and a family name that passes down patrilineally. Children take their father's last name, women traditionally change their last name when they marry, and family lineage is traced through male ancestors. This system feels inevitable, natural, the obvious way to organise identity and track kinship. It is not. It is a Viking naming protocol designed to solve a very specific problem in a very specific context, and we continue to use it in a world where that problem no longer exists, and the protocol creates as many difficulties as it solves. Picture a Viking society where formal government barely existed, where there were no birth certificates, no photo IDs, no central registries of who people were. Our identity was fluid, contextual, and often ambiguous. Many people shared the same personal names. There might be dozens of Olafs or Erics in a single region. Distinguishing between them was crucial for legal proceedings, property inheritance, and blood feud prosecution. If someone owed you wergild for killing your brother, you needed to be absolutely certain you were pursuing the right person. The wrong accusation could start a whole new cycle of violence. The Vikings solved this problem through the patronymic system. Everyone's name identified their father. Olaf Eriksson was Olaf, son of Eric. His sister might be Astrid Eriksdottir, Astrid, daughter of Eric. This immediately placed people within a kinship network, making it clear who they were related to, who was responsible for their debts and crimes, who would be expected to avenge their death. The system was elegant, functional, and deeply patrilineal. You were identified by your father's name, not your mother's, because in Viking society, legal responsibility and property rights flowed through the male line. Your father's identity mattered in ways your mother's did not, at least for legal and social purposes. This system spread throughout Northern Europe and eventually evolved into fixed family names, surnames that didn't change each generation but instead became permanent identifiers. The transition from patronymics to surnames happened gradually, across centuries, but the core principle remained. You inherited your name from your father. Women changed their names when they married to indicate the transfer from one male household to another, and family identity was traced through male ancestors. We still do this. When a child is born, they almost automatically receive their father's last name. When a woman marries, there is still tremendous social pressure for her to take her husband's name, despite no legal requirement to do so in most modern countries. People who hyphenate their names or choose other options are often seen as making a political statement, as though the default patrilineal system were neutral and alternatives were ideological. But the default system is just as ideological. It's Viking ideology, the belief that family identity should flow through the male line, that children belong to their father's lineage, that a woman's identity is properly subsumed into her husband's upon marriage. Here's what's particularly insidious about this naming rule. It makes patrilineal descent feel like biological reality rather than cultural choice. We can trace our family trees back through our fathers' fathers, their fathers before them. The names guide us, make the path obvious. Tracing descent through the maternal line is much harder, not because that lineage doesn't exist or is less real, but because the naming system doesn't support it. Mothers are erased from the official genealogical record, their identities absorbed into their husbands, their maternal surnames lost. After a few generations, most people cannot tell you their great-great-grandmother's maiden name, but they know their great-great-grandfather's surname because it's their own surname. The system creates the illusion that male descent is primary, natural, more real than female descent. Consider the awkwardness we feel around mothers who don't share their children's last name, either because they didn't take their husband's name or because they're unmarried. There's a subtle social penalty, a sense that the family is incomplete or irregular. Teachers sometimes assume such mothers are stepmothers or guardians rather than biological mothers. Legal systems sometimes require additional documentation to prove the relationship. The entire infrastructure of modern society is built around the assumption that mothers and children share a surname, and when they don't, friction results. This is not a reflection of biological reality. The mother's genetic connection to the child is at least as certain as the father's, arguably more so. It's a reflection of Viking social norms about whose identity matters and how kinship should be tracked. We've embedded these norms so deeply into our bureaucratic and social systems that deviating from them creates genuine practical difficulties, which then reinforces the sense that the Viking way is the natural way. The recent increase in people questioning these naming conventions, in couples choosing to hyphenate, in children receiving both parents' surnames, In women, keeping their own names after marriage represents the first widespread challenge to this system in centuries, and the resistance is telling. Many people feel that these alternatives are confusing, complicated, unnecessary. But they're only confusing because we're so used to the Viking system that alternatives feel like violations of natural law rather than simply different cultural choices. Perhaps most troubling is what this reveals about how completely we've internalized the Viking value that male lineage is the lineage that matters. Most people can recite their patrilineal ancestry for several generations, but know almost nothing about their matrilineal ancestry beyond their mother's maiden name. We've built our genealogical practice, our sense of family identity, our very understanding of where we come from around a naming system designed to track property inheritance through the male line in a society where women could not own property. We follow this rule without thinking, teaching it to our children as though it were inevitable, never asking whose interest it serves or what it costs us to maintain it. Let us conclude this first movement of our journey with a practice that many people have experienced without recognizing its origins, the housewarming party. When someone moves into a new home, there is often a gathering of friends and family to celebrate, to bless the new space, to bring gifts that will be useful in the new household. This seems like a natural expression of community support, a happy social occasion marking a positive life transition. And on the surface, it is exactly that. But the specific form this celebration takes, the types of gifts considered appropriate, the sense that the gathering somehow makes the house properly yours in a way that simply moving in does not. These elements come from a much darker place than most people realise. This is a Viking protective ritual designed to ward off the supernatural threats that inhabit any new dwelling space, and we continue to perform it in a world where we no longer believe those threats exist. Yet we feel uneasy if we don't. Picture a Viking family arriving at a new farmstead. Perhaps land they've claimed after a voyage, perhaps a home built on territory taken from previous inhabitants. The land is not empty in the metaphysical sense, even if no living humans currently occupy it. It is inhabited by landvetter, land spirits, who have claimed the territory from time immemorial. The previous inhabitants, if there were any, may have left behind ghosts, draugr who linger to protect their former property, or to enact revenge on those who displaced them. The very wood and stone used to build the house might contain hostile spirits. Moving into a new space is magically dangerous, a moment of profound vulnerability when the family has not yet established proper relations with the supernatural forces that govern their new home. The Vikings addressed this danger through an elaborate housewarming ritual that served multiple overlapping purposes. First, the community gathering itself, friends, neighbours, allies coming to the new home, created a protective circle of social energy, of living human presence that made it harder for hostile spirits to attack. Spirits generally avoid large gatherings of the living. They prefer to strike when people are alone, vulnerable, sleeping. A house full of witnesses, full of noise and light and warmth, is a house where spirits have difficulty operating. Second, the gift brought to a housewarming had specific protective and prosperity-inducing functions. Bread ensured the household would not go hungry. It was both practical sustenance and a magical guarantee of abundance. Salt was brought to purify the space and protect against malevolent influence. Wine or mead served as an offering to the house spirits, a way of establishing good relations through gift exchange. Firewood ensured warmth and light, keeping the darkness at bay both literally and symbolically. Each gift had a practical purpose, yes, but also a magical function, a contribution to the web of protection being woven around the new household. Third, the gathering included specific rituals meant to claim the space and drive out any hostile presences. The new residents would light fires in every room, symbolically bringing light to every corner, leaving no shadows where malevolent spirits could hide. They would make noise, sometimes quite deliberately, talking and laughing and singing to fill the space with human sound, drowning out any supernatural whispers. They would sometimes walk the boundaries of the property, carrying fire or making offerings at the corners, establishing a perimeter, marking the land as claimed and protected. These actions weren't just symbolic. The Vikings believed they had real, practical effects in securing the supernatural safety of the household. The practice evolved over centuries, losing its explicitly pagan elements but retaining its essential structure. By the Christian medieval period, you might have a priest blessing the house instead of making offerings to land spirits, but you'd still gather the community, still bring bread and salt and wine, still fill the space with light and noise and human presence. The underlying logic remained the same even as the theological explanation changed, and we still do this. When you move into a new apartment or house, you probably invite people over fairly quickly. You might not call it a housewarming party, might not formalise it quite that way, but you have people come visit, show them around, share a meal or drinks in the new space, and people bring gifts. Remarkably often, the exact same gifts the Vikings brought: bread or food, wine or alcohol, sometimes salt in the form of fancy cooking salts, candles for light. We've even retained the tradition of prioritising firewood. In modern contexts, this often becomes fancy candles or a gift basket, with tea and other warming items, but the principle of bringing warmth to the new home persists. Perhaps most tellingly, there's a superstitious feeling that a house isn't properly yours until you've had people over, until you've hosted something in the space. People talk about this explicitly. It didn't feel like home until we had everyone over. What they're expressing, without realising it, is the sense that the protective ritual hasn't been completed, that the space hasn't been properly claimed and secured until the community has gathered to bless it, to drive out whatever else might be inhabiting it, to establish human dominance over the territory. We don't believe in land spirits or Draugr anymore, but we've retained the emotional need for the ritual that protected against them. The housewarming party makes us feel safe in a new space, in ways that simply moving in does not, and we rarely stop to ask why a social gathering should have this effect. We're still performing Viking protective magic, still following a protocol designed for a world where the invisible inhabitants of a place might kill you in your sleep. And the fact that we no longer believe in those inhabitants doesn't stop us from feeling that the ritual is necessary. That, perhaps, is the deepest truth about these Viking rules we follow. Belief is not required for compliance, and the rules persist long after we've forgotten why they exist. Consider now the way we give and receive gifts, a practice surrounded by unspoken rules that nearly everyone follows, yet few can articulate clearly. You cannot simply hand someone a gift at any time. There are appropriate occasions, appropriate types of gifts for different relationships, appropriate ways to wrap and present them. When you receive a gift, you must open it in a particular way, express gratitude in a particular manner, and crucially, you must reciprocate at some point in the future with a gift of roughly equivalent value. The person who receives much more than they give feels uncomfortable, indebted. The person who gives much more than they receive feels either generous or resentful, depending on whether the imbalance was intentional. These rules feel like basic politeness, like simple human decency. They are neither simple nor particularly about decency. They are a Viking debt tracking system designed to create and maintain social obligations, to bind people together through cycles of giving and receiving that can never be fully resolved. And we follow these rules so faithfully that we've turned them into a multi-billion-dollar industry. Picture a Viking chieftain receiving visitors at his hall. These visitors might be allies, potential enemies, traders, or simply travellers seeking shelter. The chieftain's response to their arrival will set the tone for the entire relationship. He offers them gifts, food, drink, a place to sleep, perhaps more valuable items like weapons or jewellery if the visitors are particularly important. This seems like generosity, and it is, but it's also a carefully calculated political manoeuvre. By giving gifts, the chieftain creates an obligation. The recipients are now in his debt. They owe him something in return, not immediately, but at some future time when he might need it. This is the heart of the Viking gift economy. Every gift is a loan. Every act of generosity creates a bond that can be called upon later. The more valuable the gift, the greater the debt, the stronger the obligation. A chieftain who gave lavish gifts was not being foolishly generous. He was making investments, building a network of people who owed him favours, creating a web of obligation that would support him in times of need. The system worked because refusing a gift was a profound insult, a rejection of the relationship being offered. If someone offered you a gift and you refused it, you were saying that you did not want to be in their debt, that you rejected any bond with them, that you considered yourself either superior to them or hostile to them. This could start feuds, end alliances, create enemies. So people accepted gift even when they didn't want them, even when they knew the gifts would create uncomfortable obligations, because refusing was worse. Similarly, failing to reciprocate a gift was a serious offence. If someone gave you a valuable gift and you never gave anything back, you were essentially admitting that you couldn't match their generosity, that you were their inferior, their dependent. The ideal was to reciprocate with a gift of slightly greater value, demonstrating that you were not only equal to the original giver, but perhaps slightly superior. This created an escalating cycle of gift-giving where each party tried to outdo the other, with the practical result that alliances were constantly reinforced through competitive generosity. The Vikings even had a concept called a gift friendship, where two people were bound together by ongoing cycles of gift exchange. These relationships could last for generations, with children inheriting their parents' gift friendships and the accompanying obligations. The system was so complex that the sagas frequently mention gift-giving as a major plot point, with characters carefully calculating the value and timing of gifts to achieve specific social and political outcomes. This practice survived the Viking Age largely intact and became embedded in medieval European culture. The tradition of giving gifts at Christmas, for instance, combines Christian theology with Viking gift exchange protocols. You give gifts to family and friends at a specific time of year, and there's tremendous social pressure to reciprocate with gifts of roughly equivalent value. People keep mental tallies of who gave what to whom, and imbalances are noticed and judged. The person who gives only cheap gifts while receiving expensive ones is scorned as a cheapskate. The person who gives extravagant gifts that others cannot match is sometimes resented for creating uncomfortable obligations. We've retained the entire emotional and social structure of Viking gift debt, even as we've tried to drape it in the language of love and celebration. Corporate gift-giving follows exactly the same rules. Business gifts are not really gifts in the sense of free offerings with no strings attached. They are relationship-building tools, investments in future cooperation, ways of creating obligations that can be called upon later. Everyone understands this, yet we pretend not to. We call them gifts rather than bribes or investments because acknowledging the transactional nature too explicitly would violate the rules of the system, which require that gifts appear to be freely given even when everyone knows they're not. Even in personal relationships, gift-giving follows these Viking protocols more than we like to admit. Romantic partners keep rough mental tallies of who has given more, who has spent more, whose birthday gift was better. Families navigate complex webs of obligation around holidays and special occasions. People feel genuine anxiety about giving gifts that are too cheap, which would insult the recipient, or too expensive, which would create an obligation the recipient cannot comfortably repay. We've turned what should be simple expressions of affection into elaborate calculations of social debt and status positioning, and we rarely stop to ask why we're doing this, or whether it's making us happy. Here's what should disturb you. We cannot escape this system even when we recognise it. If you try to opt out, if you announce that you're not participating in gift exchanges anymore because you find them stressful and transactional, people will be hurt and offended. They will interpret your refusal as a rejection of relationship with them, exactly as Vikings would have 1,000 years ago. The system is self-reinforcing. The only way to maintain social bonds is to participate in the gift exchange. but participating in the gift exchange makes the bonds transactional rather than freely given, which then requires more gift exchange to prove that the relationship isn't purely transactional. We're trapped in a cycle that the Vikings designed, turning love and friendship into ledgers of debt, and we've convinced ourselves that this is what caring about each other looks like. Let us now examine a concept so fundamental to how we understand the world that it seems like a feature of reality itself, rather than a cultural construction. The idea of luck, and the practices we employ to court good luck and avoid bad luck. We carry lucky charms, avoid the number 13, feel uneasy about walking under ladders, throw salt over our shoulders when we spill it, avoid opening umbrellas indoors, and perform dozens of other small rituals designed to influence forces we don't really believe in. When pressed, most modern people will admit that they don't actually think these superstitions work, yet they perform them anyway, compelled by a vague sense that it's better to be safe than sorry, that these little rituals can't hurt and might help. This is pure Viking thinking, a worldview in which luck is not random chance but rather a quantifiable, personal attribute that can be cultivated, depleted, borrowed and lost. And we've retained this framework so completely that it shapes our behaviour in ways we barely recognise. Picture a Viking warrior preparing for a raid. He's not thinking about probability or statistics, concepts that don't exist in his worldview. He's thinking about his luck, his hamingja, which is simultaneously his personal fortune, his guardian spirit, and his reputation. Hamingja is not something abstract. It's a real force, almost a substance, that adheres to some people more than others. A man with strong hamingja tends to succeed in his endeavours. His crops grow well, his business ventures prosper, he survives battles that kill others, opportunities come to him as if by magic. A man with weak hamingja struggles despite his efforts, suffers misfortunes, dies young or badly. The crucial thing about hamingja is that it's not entirely fixed. It can be increased through right action and proper ritual, and it can be diminished through wrong action or spiritual contamination. This means that everything you do has potential consequences for your luck, and maintaining your luck requires constant vigilance and proper observance of protective rituals. The Viking approach to luck was intensely practical. If someone had a reputation for being lucky, you wanted them on your ship, in your raiding party as your business partner. Their luck would rub off, would increase the chances of success for everyone involved. Conversely, if someone was known to be unlucky, you avoided them, kept them away from important endeavours, because their bad luck was contagious. This wasn't cruelty. It was practical risk management in a worldview where luck is real and transferable. The Vikings developed elaborate systems for maintaining and increasing luck. Certain objects could store luck or protect against its loss. Amulets, talismans, lucky weapons that had proven themselves in battle. Certain actions could drain your luck, insulting the gods, violating oaths, showing cowardice, failing to avenge slights to your honour. Certain rituals could restore luck that had been damaged. Sacrifices to the gods, participation in important ceremonies, association with lucky people or places. The entire social and religious system was built around the management of this invisible but absolutely real force. This worldview spread throughout medieval Europe and never really left. We've stripped away most of the explicitly pagan elements, stopped making sacrifices to increase our hamingja, stopped calling it by its Old Norse name. But we've retained the core belief structure. Luck is real. It adheres to people and objects. It can be influenced through ritual action, and failing to perform the proper rituals puts you at risk. Every lucky charm, every superstitious gesture, every ritual avoidance is a continuation of Viking luck management. Consider how we talk about luck in modern contexts. We say someone is lucky or unlucky as though it's a permanent character trait, not just a description of specific events. We believe that some people have all the luck, while others are perpetually unfortunate. exactly as the Vikings believed some people had strong Hemingja while others had weak. We talk about luck running out, as though it's a finite resource that can be depleted. We perform rituals to avoid tempting fate, or jinxing ourselves, operating on the assumption that speaking of good fortune might cause it to be taken away, which is precisely the Viking concern about attracting the attention of envious gods or malevolent spirits. The business world is particularly saturated with Viking luck concepts, though we don't call it that. Lucky entrepreneurs are sought after as investors or partners. Companies keep lucky mascots or maintain superstitious rituals around important product launches. Athletes are notorious for their lucky socks, lucky routines, elaborate pre-game rituals designed to maintain their performance edge. None of these people, if you ask them directly, would say they believe in magic, but they all act as though luck is a real, manageable force that requires proper ritual maintenance, which is functionally identical to Viking belief whether or not they use that terminology. The sports world provides perhaps the clearest window into how thoroughly we've retained Viking luck concepts. Athletes at every level perform elaborate personal rituals before games, eating the same meal, putting on equipment in a specific order, following exact routines. These rituals have no logical connection to performance, but athletes feel that breaking them would disrupt their luck, would put them at a disadvantage. Teammates who are on winning streaks are considered hot and get more opportunities, while those in slumps are benched, operating on the principle that luck is contagious and you want more exposure to good luck and less to bad. Teams sometimes trade players who are considered unlucky, not because of poor performance, but because of a reputation for being associated with losses and injuries. This is Viking Hemingja management transplanted wholesale into modern professional sports. Perhaps most revealing is what happens when we try to abandon these superstitions. People who deliberately violate them, walking under ladders, opening umbrellas indoors, refusing to knock on wood, often report feeling uneasy, anxious, as though they've left themselves vulnerable. This anxiety is not rational. There is no mechanism by which opening an umbrella indoors could cause harm. But the feeling persists because we've internalized the Viking worldview so deeply that violating its rules triggers genuine emotional distress. We know intellectually that these are just superstitions, that luck isn't real in the way the Vikings thought it was, but our emotional and behavioural systems haven't caught up to our intellectual understanding. We're still Vikings trying to manage our Hemingja, still performing protective rituals against spiritual threats we no longer believe in, still treating luck as a force to be courted and preserved. The fact that we mock these behaviours even as we perform them, that we sheepishly admit to being a little superstitious while carrying lucky charms and avoiding black cats, only highlights how completely the Viking framework has colonised our thinking. We cannot escape it even when we recognise its irrationality, and that should tell us something profound about how deeply cultural patterns can embed themselves in human behaviour. Consider now one of the most pervasive and least questioned aspects of modern social life, the concept of personal honour and the extreme measures people take to defend it. We talk about defending our reputation, about not letting people disrespect us, about standing up for ourselves when we've been insulted or slighted. Road rage incidents often start with perceived disrespect. Someone cut you off, someone made a gesture, someone treated you as though your status didn't matter. People have fought, injured, even killed each other over insults, over words that caused no physical harm but somehow demanded a physical response. When asked why they escalated a trivial dispute into violence, people often say they had no choice, they couldn't let it go, their honour required a response. This is not a natural human instinct that exists across all cultures. It is a specifically Viking cultural pattern, a conception of honour as a quantifiable resource that must be defended at all costs, and it has created more suffering than perhaps any other Viking legacy we've inherited. Picture a Viking man in a crowded hall surrounded by his community, when another man insults him publicly. The insult might be about his courage, his ancestry, his wife's fidelity, his ability to manage his household. The specific content matters less than the fact that it was spoken in front of witnesses. In Viking culture, honour is not an internal state, not something you possess regardless of what others think. Honour is your reputation, your standing in the community's eyes, a form of social capital that determines your legal rights, your economic opportunities, your safety. An honourable man can testify in legal proceedings and be believed. A man without honour cannot. His word is worthless. An honourable man can make contracts, marry well, lead others. A man without honour is excluded from society, vulnerable to violence with no recourse to law, essentially dead in social terms even while physically alive. The insult spoken publicly is an attack on honour. If the insulted man does not respond, if he lets it pass without challenge, he is admitting the truth of the insult, accepting a reduction in his honour status. The witnesses will remember that he did not defend himself, and his reputation will suffer. Once reputation suffers, everything suffers. His testimony in future legal disputes will carry less weight. His trading partners will question his reliability. His household will be seen as vulnerable, a potential target for aggression. The only acceptable response is to challenge the insult, to demand satisfaction, to make the insulter take back their words or face consequences. These consequences might be a legal proceeding, where each party presents their case, and the community judges who is in the right. Or they might be a holmgang, a ritual duel, where the truth is determined through combat, the gods presumably granting victory to the party who is in the right. Or they might be the beginning of a blood feud, with the insulted party seeking revenge through violence, which would then require counter-revenge and so on in a cycle that could last for generations. The system created chronic violence. Sagas are filled with feuds that started with minor insults and escalated to dozens of deaths over decades. Men killed each other over seating arrangements, over implications of cowardice, over jokes made at feasts. Women were sometimes killed for refusing marriage proposals, because the refusal was an insult to the proposer's honour that demanded a violent response. Children inherited their parents' feuds and were expected to continue seeking revenge for insults that happened before they were born. The obsession with honour made Viking society extraordinarily violent, with murder rates that would shock modern people even in the most dangerous contemporary cities. This honour culture spread throughout medieval Europe, and, more importantly, it became embedded in the cultural DNA of large portions of the world, particularly in the American South and in Mediterranean cultures. The Code Duello, formalised rules for duelling over honour, persisted into the 20th century. Politicians, military officers and gentlemen shot each other over insults well into an era of industrialisation and scientific advancement. The practice was illegal but widely tolerated because enough people believed that honour demanded physical satisfaction for verbal offences. Modern gang culture operates on precisely these Viking honour codes. Disrespect, or disrespect, must be answered with violence or the disrespected party loses status within their community. The specific insult is almost irrelevant. Being looked at wrong, being spoken to in the wrong tone, having your authority questioned. These minimal slights trigger violent responses because the culture operates on the principle that honour must be defended regardless of cost. Young men kill each other over sneakers, over territorial boundaries, over girlfriend disputes, not because these things have inherent value, but because backing down from a challenge to honour is seen as worse than death. This is pure Viking thinking transplanted to modern contexts, operating on the same logic that led Norse warriors to kill each other over seating arrangements. Even in mainstream culture, far from gang violence, the honour code persists in softened forms. Road rage is fundamentally about honour. The other driver disrespected you by cutting you off, by driving too slowly, by making a gesture, and this disrespect demands a response. You flash your lights, honk aggressively, maybe follow them, maybe escalate to physical confrontation. The fact that none of this accomplishes anything practical, that it only increases everyone's danger and stress, is irrelevant. Honour was challenged and must be defended. Workplace conflicts often follow the same pattern. Someone disrespects you in a meeting, questions your competence, takes credit for your work. The rational response would be to let it go or address it through official channels, but the Honour Code demands immediate pushback, confrontation, public defence of your reputation. Corporate culture is full of destructive feuds that started with minor slights and escalated because neither party would back down without losing face. Here's what's particularly toxic about this Viking honour system. It makes peace almost impossible. If your honour requires that you respond to every slight, and responding to slights creates new slights that others must respond to, the system generates endless cycles of retaliation with no natural stopping point. The Vikings themselves recognised this problem, which is why they developed elaborate wergild systems where honour could be satisfied through payment rather than violence. But even these systems required both parties to agree, and often the insulted party would refuse payment, insisting that only blood could wash away the stain on their honour. The modern world has tried to suppress this honour code through law enforcement and cultural change, with mixed success. We've made duelling illegal, made assault and murder severely punished, created legal systems where you're supposed to seek redress through courts rather than personal violence. But the emotional logic of the honour code remains, and it emerges whenever legal restraints weaken or cultural pressure builds. The fact that we still use the phrase, "I couldn't let him disrespect me," as an explanation for violence shows how deeply the Viking honour framework has embedded itself in our collective psyche. We're still Vikings defending our honour, still believing that words can wound in ways that demand physical retaliation, still trapped in cycles of vengeance that reason cannot break, and people are still dying because of it. Let us turn now to a practice that shapes our daily routines without our conscious awareness, the way we structure time around meals, and particularly the concept of dinner as the main meal where families should gather together. Most Western cultures treat dinner as sacrosanct, the meal that should not be skipped, the time when the household should come together around a table to eat and converse. Missing family dinner is seen as neglectful, antisocial, a sign of a dysfunctional household. We build our schedules around ensuring everyone can be present for this meal, treating it as foundational to family cohesion and proper child rearing. This conviction feels natural, instinctive, obviously correct. It is none of these things. It is a Viking social control mechanism designed to ensure that household members were regularly accounted for, that no one was plotting against the household head, that loyalty and hierarchy were reinforced through the daily ritual of communal eating, and we continue to enforce this practice in contexts where its original purpose is not just obsolete, but actively harmful to many modern families. Picture a Viking longhouse in the evening, after the day's work is done. The household begins to gather in the hall. Family members, servants, slaves, retainers, all assembling as darkness falls. The household head takes his position at the high seat, his wife beside him if he has one. Others arrange themselves according to status, with the most honoured closest to the head and the least significant farthest away. The seating arrangement itself is a daily reminder of hierarchy, of who matters and who doesn't, of each person's place in the social order. Food is distributed according to this same hierarchy, with the best portions going to those of higher status and the scraps to those at the bottom. This is not just a meal. It is a daily performance of power and submission. The gathering serves critical practical functions in a world without modern surveillance or communication. By requiring everyone to appear at dinner, the household head can do a head count, ensuring that no one has fled, that slaves haven't escaped, that retainers are still loyal and present. It's an opportunity to observe everyone's demeanour, to detect signs of plotting or dissatisfaction, to identify potential threats before they materialise. In a society where household members might include people brought back from raids, slaves from enemy territories, disgruntled servants who might poison their masters, this daily assembly is a security measure disguised as social ritual. The dinner conversation serves as an intelligence-gathering operation. People are expected to share what they did that day, what they observed, what news they heard. The household head can assess the productivity of his workers, the trustworthiness of his retainers, the loyalty of his family members. Silence or evasiveness is suspicious and noted. The meal itself becomes a kind of interrogation, softened by food and drink, but nonetheless a mechanism for maintaining control over information and people. Additionally, the communal meal reinforces bonds and obligations. By eating food provided by the household head, by accepting his hospitality daily, household members are repeatedly acknowledging his authority and their dependence on him. In Viking culture, accepting someone's food created an obligation. You owed loyalty to the person who fed you. This wasn't just a pleasant sentiment, it was a binding social and spiritual law. Eating together every day renewed and strengthened these bonds, making betrayal more difficult psychologically and more dangerous spiritually. The Vikings also believed that the household spirits, the attendant supernatural beings who protected the home, were present at these communal meals and needed to be acknowledged and honoured. Part of the food might be offered to them, set aside or spilled deliberately to maintain their goodwill. The dinner gathering was thus also a religious ritual, a daily recommitment to the household gods and spirits who ensured prosperity and protection. Missing the communal dinner without good reason was treated as serious misconduct. It suggested disloyalty, potential plotting, rejection of the household bonds. Someone who routinely ate separately, who refused to participate in the communal meal, was signalling their intention to break away or their hostility to the household head. Such behaviour would be confronted, potentially punished, because it threatened the entire structure of household control and cohesion. This practice spread throughout medieval Europe and became so deeply embedded in cultural practice that it persisted essentially unchanged through industrialisation and into the modern era. The Victorian ideal of the family dinner, with everyone gathered around the table and the father at the head, is a direct continuation of the Viking longhouse meal, maintaining the same functions of hierarchy display, social control and loyalty reinforcement. We've softened the rhetoric, emphasising togetherness and communication rather than surveillance and submission, but the essential structure remains. Modern parenting advice is obsessed with family dinner, treating it as crucial for child development and family bonding. Parents who cannot manage regular family dinners due to work schedules or other constraints often feel guilty, inadequate, as though they're failing at something fundamental. This guilt is the echo of Viking social expectations, the sense that gathering for the evening meal is not just nice but necessary, that households without this ritual are somehow disordered or dysfunctional. But consider who this rule actually serves in modern contexts. For households where all members have similar schedules and genuinely enjoy each other's company, communal dinner can indeed be pleasant and bonding. But for many modern families, the enforced dinner is a source of stress, conflict and resentment. Parents rush home from work stressed and exhausted to prepare and serve a meal that everyone is expected to attend. Teenagers with evening activities or study commitments are pulled away from their needs to fulfill the dinner ritual. Family members who don't particularly like each other are forced into proximity daily, creating friction and tension. The meal becomes an obligation rather than a pleasure, a performance of normalcy that may not reflect actual family dynamics. Moreover, the insistence on dinner as the primary meal disadvantages people whose schedules don't fit this pattern. Shift workers, people with evening jobs, families where parents work different hours to ensure childcare coverage. These households are implicitly judged as lesser, as not properly caring for family cohesion, when in fact they're simply adapting to economic realities that don't conform to a Viking agricultural schedule where everyone's work ended at sunset. Yet we persist in treating the communal dinner as sacred, as fundamentally necessary, following a rule designed for household heads who needed to count their slaves and detect plotting among their retainers. We're still performing a surveillance ritual from a world of chronic household betrayal, still using food distribution to reinforce hierarchy and extract loyalty, and we've convinced ourselves that this is what family love looks like. Consider now a practice that most Western cultures treat as foundational to justice and truth. The oath, the swearing of promises in formal context with some higher power invoked as witness. In court, witnesses swear to tell the truth with their hand on a Bible, calling God to witness their testimony. At citizenship ceremonies, new citizens swear allegiance to their adopted country. Politicians take oaths of office, invoking divine witness to their commitment to uphold the law. Marriages are solemnized through exchange vows that are treated as sacred promises. Breaking an oath, committing perjury, violating a sworn promise is considered one of the most serious moral offences, punished severely by law and condemned by social consensus. This treatment of oaths as uniquely binding, as different in kind from mere promises, feels natural and right, reflecting something fundamental about human morality and divine justice. It reflects neither. It is a Viking legal technology designed for a society without writing, without the ability to create enforceable contracts through documentation, and we continue to treat oaths as sacred in a world where we could simply sign papers instead, because the emotional weight of the Viking oath system is too heavy to escape. Picture a Viking thing, an assembly where legal disputes are being settled. Two men are in conflict over land boundaries, each claiming that a particular field belongs to him. There are no written deeds, no surveys, no official records to consult. The dispute will be settled through testimony. Each party will present their case, bring witnesses to support their claim, and the assembly will judge based on whose testimony is more credible. But how do you determine credibility when people can simply lie? The Vikings solved this problem through the oath system, which combined religious terror with social pressure to create something that approached reliable testimony. A person giving testimony would first swear an oath, calling on the gods to witness their words and promising that they spoke truth. The specific formula varied, but typically involved invoking Thor, Odin, or other gods by name, and asking these gods to punish the oath-taker if they lied. The punishment was not legal. The assembly wouldn't punish perjury directly. The punishment was supernatural. The gods would curse the oath-breaker, would bring misfortune upon them and their family, would ensure that they died badly and were remembered as oath-breakers forever. In a culture where reputation survived death, and where divine curses were considered absolutely real, this threat was terrifying. To swear a false oath was to invite supernatural destruction, to mark yourself as someone the gods themselves would punish. Most people would not risk this, even to win a legal case or protect a friend. The oath made lying feel impossible, not just wrong but existentially dangerous. The system had additional refinements. The value of an oath varied based on who was swearing it. A free man of good reputation who had never broken an oath carried maximum credibility. His oath could outweigh the testimony of multiple people of lesser status. Slaves could not swear oaths at all in most contexts. Their testimony was worthless because they lacked honour and legal standing. Women's oaths carried less weight than men's in many circumstances. The entire legal system was built around this hierarchy of oath value, with disputes often coming down to whose oath counted for more. There were also compound oaths, where multiple people swore together to support someone's testimony. If you claimed something and brought 12 respected men to swear with you that you spoke truly, your claim was considered proven even without physical evidence. This created strong incentives for maintaining good social relations. If you needed oath helpers, and no one was willing to swear on your behalf, you would lose legal disputes regardless of the actual facts. Some disputes were settled through oath-taking on sacred rings or other objects believed to have special divine connection, increasing the spiritual danger of lying and thus the reliability of the testimony. The most serious oaths might be sworn at sacred sites, standing on ground consecrated to the gods, with religious officials present to witness. The location and ritual amplified the oath's power, made it even more binding, even more dangerous to violate. This system worked remarkably well for its context. It enabled a largely illiterate society to settle disputes, make contracts, and establish truth without written records. The religious terror and social pressure combined to make oaths generally reliable, at least among free people who had reputation to lose. But here's the disturbing part. We've retained this entire system despite no longer needing it, and despite no longer believing in the supernatural mechanisms that made it work. Modern courts still require oaths, still have people swear on religious texts to tell the truth, still treat the oath as though it has special binding power beyond a simple promise. But we don't actually believe that God will punish perjurers, at least not reliably or immediately. We've added legal penalties for perjury precisely because we don't trust the oath itself to ensure truthfulness. We require the oath, and then back it up with laws that make the oath redundant. We could simply make lying in court illegal without the oath ceremony, but we persist in requiring the religious formula because it feels necessary. Because the Viking sense that truth requires divine witness has embedded itself so deeply in our legal culture that removing it would feel wrong, unsafe, as though we were no longer serious about truth. Marriage vows operate on the same principle. People swear before God, or in the presence of witnesses, to remain faithful to their spouse, to honour their commitments, till death do they part. These vows are treated as more binding than mere promises, as sacred obligations that should not be broken lightly. Yet we also have legal contracts, prenuptial agreements, marriage licenses, all the apparatus of modern documentation. The oath is technically redundant. We could simply sign papers agreeing to legal partnership, but we don't feel married without the vows, without the spoken promises made before witnesses, without the invocation of higher powers to bind us to our commitments. We're still Vikings swearing before the gods, still convinced that something about speaking promises aloud in formal ritual makes them more real than simply agreeing to them or signing documents. The persistence of oath-taking in secular contexts is even stranger. Political oaths of office, citizenship oaths, military enlistment oaths, these all follow the Viking formula even when no religion is invoked. People swear, speaking formal words, calling witnesses, treating the spoken promise as creating a special kind of obligation. We've tried to remove the explicitly religious elements, but the structure remains, the sense that swearing creates a bond that mere agreement does not. Perhaps most troubling is that we've retained the Viking hierarchy of whose oaths matter more. In practice, testimony from respected professionals carries more weight than testimony from poor people or people with criminal records. We claim to value all testimony equally, but juries and judges unconsciously weight credibility based on social status, education, appearance, all proxies for the Viking concept of honour. A successful businessman's sworn testimony is believed more readily than an unemployed person's, regardless of actual truthfulness, because we're still operating on the assumption that high-status people have more to lose from oath-breaking and are therefore more reliable. We follow these Viking oath rules despite having better alternatives, despite no longer believing in the gods who are supposed to enforce them, despite knowing that oaths alone don't prevent lying. We follow them because the emotional conviction that oaths are special, that sworn promises carry unique weight, that calling witnesses makes commitments more binding. This conviction is too deep to dislodge through mere rational argument. We're still Vikings, terrified of divine punishment for oath-breaking, still structuring our most important legal and social ceremonies around a technology designed for a world without writing, and we cannot imagine doing it any other way. Let us now examine a social practice that governs intimate relationships in ways we rarely question. The expectation that romantic couples should sleep in the same bed every night, that married people who sleep separately are somehow failing at their relationship, that physical proximity during sleep is crucial to intimacy and partnership. Separate bedrooms for married couples are often seen as a sign of problems, of emotional distance, of a relationship that has failed to maintain its closeness. Couples who sleep apart often hide this fact from friends and family, treating it as something shameful that suggests dysfunction. This conviction that couples should share sleeping space feels natural, romantic, obviously correct. Sleeping beside your partner is presented as one of the fundamental pleasures and necessities of a committed relationship. This is not a universal human practice. Many cultures have had and still have very different sleeping arrangements. This particular pattern, the expectation that couples share a bed nightly, regardless of preference or sleep quality, is a Viking practice with a specific, unromantic purpose. And we've romanticised what was originally a security measure into a mandatory expression of love. Picture a Viking household at night, in an era when assassination was common, when household members might include slaves who had been taken in raids and had every reason to murder their captors, when blood feuds meant that enemies might infiltrate your household disguised as servants or guests. The night time was extraordinarily dangerous. The Old Norse word for morning, morgun, literally means the murder time, reflecting the fact that dawn attacks on sleeping households were a standard tactic. People were most vulnerable while sleeping, and therefore needed protective measures. The married couple sleeping together was one such measure. Husbands and wives shared a bed not primarily for romance or intimacy, but for mutual protection. The wife could watch while the husband slept. The husband could watch while the wife slept. Two people sleeping together were harder to kill than one person sleeping alone. An attacker would have to deal with both, and the second person could raise an alarm, grab a weapon, fight back. The practice was fundamentally defensive, a doubling of vigilance during the most vulnerable hours. This was especially important for household heads, who were the primary targets of assassination. A chieftain who slept alone was asking to be murdered. A chieftain who slept with his wife had at least some protection, someone who could wake him if danger approached, someone who shared his fate, and therefore had incentive to keep them both alive. The arrangement wasn't about emotional support or sexual access. Those could be managed in other ways. It was about survival. The Vikings even had specific sleeping arrangements designed to maximize security. The married couple often slept in a closed bed, essentially a box built into the wall with wooden doors that could be shut and barred from inside. This created a defendable position, a mini fortress within the house. An attacker would have to break through the doors, making noise and giving the occupants time to arm themselves. The couple sleeping together inside this closed bed were significantly safer than they would be sleeping separately in open spaces. Children, servants, and slaves slept in different areas of the house, arranged according to status and threat level. The most trusted retainers might sleep in the hall near the household head's sleeping area, providing an additional layer of defence. The least trusted, slaves, recent captures, would be housed farthest from the family's sleeping quarters, sometimes in separate buildings, reducing their opportunity to attack at night. The entire spatial arrangement of the Viking household was organised around nighttime security concerns. As Viking society evolved and assassination became less common, the practice of couples sleeping together persisted, but its justification changed. By the medieval period, the practice was being explained in terms of marital duty, procreation, and emotional intimacy rather than mutual defence. The church promoted shared sleeping as proper for married couples, connecting it to sexual availability and the prevention of adultery. If spouses slept together, they could satisfy each other's needs and would have less temptation to stray. The defensive origins were forgotten or deliberately obscured, replaced with explanations that made the practice seem naturally connected to love and partnership rather than to fear and violence. This rationalisation spread throughout European culture and became deeply embedded in assumptions about proper marriage. By the Victorian era, separate bedrooms for married couples were seen as suspicious, potentially indicating adultery or marital breakdown. The ideology became even more rigid. Not only should couples sleep in the same room, they should sleep in the same bed, bodies touching, demonstrating physical intimacy nightly. Anything less suggested a failure of romantic love. Modern culture has inherited this expectation almost unchanged. Relationship advice commonly promotes shared sleeping as crucial for intimacy, despite growing evidence that many people sleep better alone, and that sleep quality affects relationship quality more than sleeping proximity does. Studies show that couples who sleep separately often report higher relationship satisfaction and better individual health outcomes, yet they're reluctant to admit this arrangement to others because of the stigma attached. The assumption remains that real couples, healthy couples, couples in love, sleep together every night. But consider what we've done. We've taken a security measure designed for a world where you might be murdered in your sleep by your own slaves, and we've transformed it into a mandatory expression of romantic love. We've made a defensive strategy into a relationship ideal, and we judge couples who deviate from it as somehow deficient, less committed, less in love. People sacrifice sleep quality, endure partners who snore or thrash, or keep different hours, just to comply with this rule that originated in fear of assassination. Here's what should disturb you. We continue this practice even when it actively harms us, when it disrupts sleep and creates resentment, because the cultural conviction that couples should sleep together is stronger than our actual experience of whether it's beneficial. We've romanticised a Viking security protocol so thoroughly that we cannot see it for what it was: a practical response to chronic violence, not a natural expression of intimacy. Modern couples lie awake beside partners who disrupt their sleep, feeling that they must endure this because sharing a bed is what love requires, never knowing that they're following a rule designed for people who feared being stabbed by their servants in the night. The rule persists not because it serves our needs, but because it served Viking needs so well that it became invisible, unquestionable, sacred, and we've forgotten how to ask whether we still need the protection it once provided, or whether we're just performing a ritual from a more violent age. Consider now a concept that shapes modern professional life in profound ways: the idea of the work week, and specifically the belief that working long hours demonstrates commitment and virtue, while leaving work at reasonable times suggests laziness or lack of dedication. We praise people who stay late at the office, who work weekends, who check emails at all hours, treating their exhaustion as evidence of admirable work ethic. We view people who maintain boundaries, who leave at 5 o'clock, who refuse to respond to work communications during personal time with suspicion. Are they really committed? Are they team players? Are they willing to do what it takes to succeed? This valorization of overwork, this equation of hours with virtue, feels like modern capitalist pressure, like a recent development connected to corporate culture and economic competition. It is neither modern nor capitalist. It is a Viking agricultural survival strategy that we've transplanted to office environments where it makes no sense and actively harms people, but we cannot escape it because the cultural programming runs too deep. Picture a Viking farming household in summer, the season when survival for the coming year is determined. The growing season in Scandinavia was brutally short. Frost could come early, destroying crops before they matured. Every day of good weather had to be maximised. Fields needed to be planted, tended, weeded, protected from animals and weather. Hay needed to be cut and dried during the brief windows when rain held off. Every adult and child capable of work would be mobilised for these critical tasks. There was no concept of reasonable hours, of work-life balance, of personal time. You worked from dawn until you physically could not continue, and then you worked some more, because if you didn't, your family would starve during the winter. The community watched and judged who worked hard and who shirked. A man who left the fields while daylight remained, who took breaks when others were still labouring, who prioritised rest over productivity during the crucial summer months, was marked as lazy, unreliable, a bad risk for partnership or alliance. His family's survival was less assured, but more importantly, his reputation suffered. Remember that honour and reputation determined your legal standing, your ability to make contracts, your safety from violence. A reputation for laziness was genuinely dangerous. It meant others would be less likely to help you in times of need, less likely to believe your testimony in disputes, more likely to see you as a weak target for aggression. The summer work frenzy was not just economic necessity but social performance, a demonstration of your worth as a community member and your commitment to collective survival. Conversely, the person who worked longest, who pushed through exhaustion, who never complained about the brutal labour, earned respect and status. This person was considered more valuable, more trustworthy, more deserving of help and alliance. Their excessive work became a form of social capital, proof of character that could be drawn upon in other contexts. The Vikings even had a concept called berserker work, periods of such intense labour that the person entered an altered state, working with superhuman energy and endurance, immune to fatigue and pain. This was admired, celebrated, seen as virtuous rather than concerning. This pattern made sense in agricultural contexts where productivity directly determined survival and where work genuinely needed to be done during specific, limited windows. If you didn't harvest the grain when it was ready, it would rot in the field. If you didn't get the hay dried before rain came, your animals would starve in winter. The intensity and the judgment were appropriate to the stakes and the constraints. But this pattern has been transplanted to modern office work, where it makes no sense whatsoever. Most office work has no genuine time constraints. The report that needs to be finished by Friday does not need to be finished at 9 p.m. on Thursday. It could be finished during normal hours on Friday with better planning. The emails do not need to be answered at midnight. They could wait until morning with no actual harm. The meeting does not need to happen at 7 a.m. before everyone's real workday begins. It could be scheduled during normal business hours if we simply made different choices about scheduling. But we judge people who make these rational choices as though they were Viking farmers abandoning the fields during harvest season, as though their refusal to work excessive hours were a moral failing rather than a reasonable boundary. The person who leaves at 5 p.m. is seen as less committed than the person who stays until 8 p.m, regardless of whether the additional hours produce any valuable output. The person who doesn't check email on weekends is considered less dedicated than the person who responds to messages at all hours, regardless of whether weekend email responses actually benefit the organisation. We've retained the Viking valorisation of exhaustion as virtue, while stripping away the context that made it make sense. Perhaps most damaging is how this affects evaluation and advancement. In many professional environments, long hours are used as a proxy for commitment and competence. People who work late are assumed to be more valuable, more promotable, more deserving of advancement than people who work normal hours, even when actual productivity metrics don't support this assumption. Studies have repeatedly shown that long hours do not correlate with better output in most knowledge work. After a certain point, fatigue reduces quality, and innovation more than additional time increases production. But we ignore this evidence because the Viking conviction that more work equals more virtue is too deep to dislodge. This particularly disadvantages people with caregiving responsibilities, disproportionately women, who cannot stay late because they need to pick up children or care for elderly relatives. They are judged as less committed, less serious about their careers, less worthy of advancement, not because their work is lower quality, but because they refuse to perform the ritual of excessive hours that we've inherited from Viking agriculture. We've created workplaces that function as performance spaces for Viking work ethic, rather than as efficient producers of value, and we punish people who refuse to perform. The destructive effects are well documented: burnout, stress-related illness, relationship breakdown, mental health deterioration. People work themselves sick, work themselves to death in some cases, because they've internalized the belief that their worth as humans is measured by their willingness to sacrifice themselves to work, exactly as a Viking farmer's worth was measured by their willingness to work until they dropped during harvest season. Corporate wellness programs try to address the symptoms, offering meditation apps, standing desks, mental health days, while maintaining the underlying culture that creates the problem. It's a perfect example of how deeply Viking rules have embedded themselves. We can recognise that overwork is harmful, we can produce studies and programs addressing it, but we cannot shake the fundamental conviction that working excessive hours demonstrates virtue and that reasonable boundaries demonstrate inadequacy. We're still Viking farmers racing against frost and starvation, even though we're sitting in climate-controlled offices where nothing we do has genuine time constraints, and we judge each other accordingly, unable to escape the agricultural urgency of a world we left behind 1,000 years ago. Let us now examine one of the most peculiar and universal practices in Western dining: the expectation that guests should compliment the food they are served, that hosts should deflect these compliments with self-deprecation, and that the entire interaction should follow a scripted dance of praise and modest denial. When someone serves you a meal, you're expected to say it's delicious, even if it's mediocre. The host will then say something like, "Oh, it's nothing special," or "I think I overcooked it a bit," even if they're proud of their work. This ritual continues back and forth, the guest insisting the food is wonderful, the host insisting it's not their best effort, in a performance that everyone recognises as slightly absurd but feels compelled to enact. Failing to compliment the food is a serious social offence, interpreted as rudeness or ingratitude. Accepting a compliment too readily is also an offence suggesting arrogance or lack of humility. We navigate these rules without conscious thought, having internalised them so thoroughly that deviation feels wrong, rude, socially dangerous. This is not natural human politeness. It is a Viking poison detection and loyalty testing protocol that we've transformed into a ritual of politeness, and understanding its origins makes modern dinner parties considerably more sinister. Picture a Viking feast where the host has prepared food for guests who might be political rivals, potential enemies, or allies whose loyalty is uncertain. The host needs to know, is this food safe, and are these guests genuinely friendly or merely pretending? The compliment ritual solves both problems simultaneously. When a guest eats the food and compliments it, they are performing a complex social magical act. First, by eating the food enthusiastically and immediately, they demonstrate that they don't believe it's poisoned. If they suspected poison, they would refuse to eat or would eat reluctantly, watching the host's reaction. Enthusiastic eating is a trust signal. Second, by complimenting the food, they invoke the concept of food gift reciprocity. In Viking culture, praising someone's hospitality created an obligation. You were acknowledging the gift of food and implicitly promising to reciprocate with loyalty or future hospitality. Compliments weren't just nice words, they were binding social contracts, creating debt and obligation. A genuine compliment meant you were accepting the relationship being offered, committing yourself to the host's social network, acknowledging their generosity in ways that would require repayment. Third, the specific content of the compliment could reveal your true feelings. Excessive, over-the-top praise might indicate fear or deception. You're trying too hard to appear friendly because you are actually hostile. Insufficient praise or qualified compliments, "It's good, though a bit salty," suggest criticism and potential hostility. The ideal compliment was warm but proportionate, enthusiastic but not desperate, specific but not analytical. Getting the calibration right was a social skill that could mean the difference between successful alliance building and mortal insult. The host's response served equally important functions. By deflecting the compliment with self-deprecation, the host accomplished several things. First, they demonstrated that they didn't need to boast. that their hospitality was so assured they could afford to downplay it. This was actually a display of confidence. Only someone certain of their status could dismiss their own achievements. Second, the self-deprecation was a kind of test. If the guest accepted the host's dismissal and stopped complimenting, that suggested the guest didn't really appreciate the food or the hospitality, that their initial compliment was just empty politeness. A properly loyal guest would insist, would contradict the host's self-deprecation, would argue that the food really was excellent. This back and forth tested the guest's commitment. How hard would they work to please the host? How much effort would they invest in maintaining the social fiction? Finally, the host's self-deprecation was magical protection against envy and malevolent spirits. In Viking belief, boasting attracted the attention of hostile supernatural forces who would seek to punish pride and reduce the boaster to proper humility through misfortune. By preemptively diminishing their achievement, the host avoided this supernatural danger. They got credit for excellent hospitality, while protecting themselves from the curse that would come from acknowledging it too directly. The entire exchange was thus a complex negotiation of trust, loyalty, status, and supernatural threat, condensed into a few ritualized sentences about whether the roast was properly seasoned. This practice spread throughout medieval Europe and persisted with remarkable consistency. Table manners treatises from the medieval and early modern periods consistently emphasized the obligation to praise the host's food and the host's obligation to modestly deflect such praise. The rationale changed. By the Victorian era, it was explained as proper politeness rather than as poison detection or spirit protection, but the ritual remained functionally identical. Modern etiquette books still teach this exact pattern. Guests must compliment, hosts must demur. Both parties must recognise this as a required performance rather than honest communication. And here we are, in a world where poisoning dinner guests is extraordinarily rare and where we don't believe in envious spirits, still performing this elaborate ritual. We teach children to compliment the cook, to say, "This is delicious," even if they don't particularly like the food. We train them that honesty about food quality is rude, that the social ritual matters more than truthful communication. We teach hosts to deflect compliments, to never simply say, "Thank you, I'm glad you like it," but instead to engage in the modest denial dance. We've created a situation where genuine communication about food quality is almost impossible at social gatherings because the ritual requirements override honest feedback. Consider how this plays out in practice. You eat at a friend's house, and the food is genuinely mediocre, overcooked, underseasoned, not particularly good. You still compliment it effusively, because not complimenting would be a relationship-ending offence. The host deflects, saying they think it could have been better. You insist it's wonderful. They insist it's not their best work. Neither of you is being honest, but you're both following the rules, and following the rules maintains the relationship. But what has been communicated? Nothing about the food itself. What's been communicated is that you're both willing to perform the required rituals, that you both know the social codes, that you value the relationship enough to lie politely to each other. It's a Viking loyalty test transplanted to a context where the stakes are minuscule, but the emotional requirements remain enormous. The flip side is equally telling. The person who honestly critiques the food, who says, "I think it's a bit bland," or "it's not really my taste," is treated as though they've committed a serious social offence, even if their feedback is accurate and potentially helpful. We've prioritised the ritual over actual communication, the performance over genuine connection, because the Viking prohibition against honest food criticism is too deep to override through reason. We're still testing each other's loyalty at the dinner table, still protecting ourselves from supernatural envy through false modesty, still performing a script designed for a world where your dinner guests might be trying to kill you, and we call it good manners. Consider now a practice that governs one of the most intimate aspects of human life, the conventions around courtship, dating, and the initiation of romantic relationships. In most Western cultures, There are unspoken but powerful rules about who should make the first move, who should pay for dates, how quickly physical intimacy should progress, what signals indicate interest versus friendliness. These rules vary somewhat by context and generation, but certain patterns persist. Men are generally expected to initiate, to pursue, to take the risk of rejection. Women are expected to signal availability subtly, to wait to be chosen, to manage the pace of physical intimacy. Deviations from these patterns are often judged harshly. Women who pursue men too directly are sometimes seen as desperate or unfeminine. Men who fail to pursue are seen as weak or uninterested. The entire structure feels like it must reflect something deep about human nature, about biological differences between men and women, about evolutionary psychology and reproductive strategy. It reflects none of these things. It is a Viking property negotiation protocol that we've romanticized into dating advice, and recognizing this should fundamentally change how we think about modern relationships. Picture a Viking, society where marriage was primarily an economic and political arrangement, a merger of households, a transfer of property from one family to another. The bride was, in most cases, a form of property herself, not in the sense of being an object without agency, but in the sense that her family had invested resources in raising her and expected compensation for transferring her productive and reproductive capacity to another household. The prospective husband needed to prove he could afford her, could protect her, could provide for her and any children. This was not romance. This was business. The courtship protocols reflected this reality. A man who wanted to marry would approach the woman's father, not the woman herself. He would negotiate a bride price, payment to the father for the loss of his daughter's labour and the transfer of her to another household. He would also negotiate what the bride would bring to the marriage, her dowry, which remained technically hers even after marriage and provided some security if she was widowed. These negotiations were complex and could take months, involving detailed discussions of land, livestock, goods, future inheritance rights, and the status of any children born from the union. The woman's consent was legally required in some contexts, but not particularly emphasized. She was expected to accept the arrangement her father made unless the proposed husband was unusually unsuitable. Her father had the right to reject suitors he deemed unworthy, and worthiness was measured primarily in economic terms. Does this man have enough resources to support my daughter? Is his family of sufficient status? Will this alliance benefit our household? If a man courted a woman without going through her father, if he tried to win her affection directly and convinced her to marry against her father's wishes, this was considered a serious offence, essentially theft of property. The father had been deprived of his right to negotiate the terms of the exchange, to receive appropriate compensation for his daughter. Such marriages could be annulled, and the man could be punished for his presumption. The proper protocol was always to negotiate with the father first, to prove your worth through the offer you could make, and only then to interact with the woman herself, and even then only in supervised contexts where her father could ensure nothing inappropriate occurred before the marriage contract was finalised. The expectation that men initiate, that men pursue, that men prove their worth to gain access to women comes directly from this property negotiation framework. The man was the buyer, the father was the seller, the woman was the commodity being transferred. The buyer had to demonstrate his ability to pay, his worthiness to possess such valuable property. The woman's role was to be worth purchasing, to maintain her value through proper behaviour, and to accept the arrangement that gave her family the best deal. This is not a romantic framework. It's a commercial one, and it treats women's humanity as secondary to their economic function. As Viking influence spread and merged with other European traditions, these courtship protocols persisted, but their justification shifted. By the medieval period, the economics were partially obscured behind the language of chivalry and romance. Knights proved their worth to ladies not through bride price negotiations, but through tournaments and quests, through demonstrations of martial prowess and devotion. But the underlying structure remained. Men pursue, men prove their worth, men take the risk and initiative, women wait to be chosen, women judge the offers they receive. Women's value is in being desirable rather than in desiring. The economic transaction was still happening. Dowries and bride prices continued throughout the medieval period, but it was wrapped in romantic language that made it seem like something other than property transfer. This framework persisted through subsequent centuries with remarkably little change. Victorian courtship still involved men calling on women, men asking fathers for permission to court, men proposing marriage, and women accepting or refusing. The economic aspects became less explicit as love marriages became more common, but the gendered power dynamics remained. Men act, women react, men choose, women are chosen, men risk rejection, women risk being unchosen. Modern dating advice still reflects these Viking property negotiation patterns. Men are told they need to be confident, to approach women, to handle rejection and keep trying. Women are told to be subtle, to signal interest without being too forward, to let men pursue because men need to feel like hunters. The language has changed. We talk about evolutionary psychology and gender roles rather than bride prices and property transfers. But the behavioural prescription is identical to Viking courtship protocols. Men prove their worth through the initiative they take and the resources they display. Women prove their worth through the desirability they maintain and the selectivity they demonstrate. Neither party is encouraged to deviate from these roles, and those who do face social penalties. Women who ask men out directly, who pursue rather than waiting to be pursued, are often judged negatively, not just by men but by other women who've internalised the rule that women should be chosen rather than choosing. Men who are passive, who wait for women to make the first move, are often seen as unmasculine, as failing to fulfil the male role of pursuer and risk-taker. The rules constrain everyone, but they serve the original purpose. They maintain the structure of a property negotiation even though we've stopped calling it that. Here's what should disturb you. We've retained the behavioural patterns of a system where women were property being transferred between men, but we've convinced ourselves this reflects natural gender differences. We've taken Viking property law and rebranded it as biology, as evolutionary necessity, as just how attraction works. This allows the patterns to persist, even as we've supposedly granted women legal equality, economic independence, and full personhood. The structure remains because the cultural programming is too deep, and we defend it using new justifications that obscure its actual origins in a time when women literally could not own property or enter contracts independently. Modern relationship dysfunction often stems from the collision between Viking courtship protocols and contemporary values of equality and mutual choice. People want relationships based on genuine mutual attraction and choice, but they're also following scripts that assume men pursue and women are pursued, that men prove their worth through initiative and resources, that women prove their worth through desirability and selectivity. These scripts create confusion, resentment, and dissatisfaction because they're built for a transactional system we claim to have abandoned. We're trying to build partnerships using rules designed for property transfers, and then we wonder why our relationships feel transactional rather than freely chosen, why gender roles create so much conflict, why dating feels like a game with arbitrary rules, rather than a process of genuine connection. We're still following Viking property negotiation protocols, still performing the roles of buyer and commodity, and we've forgotten that there might be other ways to form relationships, ways that don't require one person to pursue while the other waits to be chosen, ways that don't make human connection into a market transaction, where worth must be proven and value must be demonstrated before love is permitted. Let us conclude this middle movement of our examination with one of the most pervasive and least acknowledged Viking inheritances, the way we think about aging, particularly the belief that youth is valuable and old age is decline, that being called old is an insult, that aging bodies should be hidden and aging people should gracefully withdraw from public life. We spend billions on anti-aging products, on cosmetic procedures to maintain youthful appearance, on gyms and diets and supplements that promise to delay the inevitable. Older people face discrimination in employment, in media representation, in social visibility. The message is clear and consistent. Being old is bad, looking old is shameful, accepting aging is giving up. This obsession with youth and horror of age feels like modern vanity, like capitalism selling insecurity, like the shallow values of a culture obsessed with appearance. But the framework is much older, much darker, and understanding its origins might change how we think about what we lose when we follow these rules. Picture a Viking society where survival depended on physical capacity, where there was no retirement, no social security, no safety net for those who could no longer work. You survived because you could do the brutal labour required. Farming, fighting, sailing, building. When your body failed, when age weakened you to the point where you could no longer contribute productive labour, you became a burden on your household. You consumed resources without producing them. In a subsistence economy where one bad harvest could mean starvation, where every mouth to feed had to justify itself through work, being old and weak was genuinely dangerous, not just for you, but for everyone who had to support you. The Vikings made brutal calculations about resource allocation, and the elderly who could no longer work sometimes lost their places in the social hierarchy or even their right to continued life. This manifested in several disturbing practices. In times of severe hardship, elderly people might be abandoned, left to die so that younger, more productive family members could survive. The sagas occasionally mention elderly people going into the forest or mountains to die when they realised they were becoming burdens, framing this as honourable self-sacrifice rather than being forced out. Whether these deaths were truly voluntary or were socially coerced abandonment disguised as choice is unclear, but the pattern is consistent. Old age without productivity was precarious, potentially fatal. Even in better times, elderly people experienced significant status loss. The young and strong made decisions, controlled property, led expeditions, dominated social and political life. The old who could no longer fight or work were tolerated, sometimes honoured for past achievements, but not included in active governance unless they retained unusual mental capacity or political connections. Physical decline meant social decline, loss of voice, loss of power, marginalisation within their own households and communities. The culture valorised youth, strength, vigour, all the qualities that made someone useful in a harsh physical environment. Old age was, at best, a time to be endured while hoping for death in battle, or some other end that would preserve reputation rather than allow decay into complete dependency and uselessness. This created a cultural framework where aging was viewed with horror and contempt. You were valuable while you were strong and became progressively less valuable as you weakened. Your worth as a human was directly tied to your physical capacity, and losing that capacity meant losing your humanity in some fundamental sense. The ideal death was early, in battle, at the peak of your strength, not late in a bed, weakened by age and illness. The warriors who died fighting were promised entry to Valhalla, where they would feast and fight eternally, always in their prime. The elderly who died in bed had a much less desirable afterlife, reflecting the culture's deep ambivalence about the value of a long life that ended in weakness. This framework spread throughout medieval Europe and became embedded in cultural values that persist today. We've removed the most brutal practices. We no longer abandon elderly people in forests, at least not literally, but we've retained the core belief structure. Youth is valuable, old age is decline, physical weakness is shameful, and people should try to maintain youthful capacity for as long as possible, or gracefully disappear from public view when they can't. Modern ageism is Viking value system, applied in a context where it's no longer necessary or justified. We don't live in a subsistence economy where every person must justify their existence through physical labour. We have the resources to support people who can't work. We have technology that makes physical strength less critical for most activities. We have medical knowledge and care systems that can maintain quality of life well into old age. Yet we still treat ageing as shameful, still view elderly people as burdens, still structure our media, our workplaces and our social spaces as though only young people matter. The cosmetics industry, the anti-aging medical industry, the entire apparatus of age denial is built on Viking contempt for the weak, and elderly transplanted to a world where that contempt makes no practical sense. Consider how we talk about aging. We fight aging. We combat wrinkles. We battle decline, using the language of warfare to describe a natural biological process. The implication is that aging is an enemy, that signs of age are defeats, that visible aging is a failure requiring concealment or correction. We praise people who don't look their age, treating younger appearance as an accomplishment, and age-appropriate appearance as something embarrassing. We celebrate people who remain young at heart, or maintain youthful activities, implicitly judging those who actually age as having given up or failed. The message is consistent. Looking old is bad, being old is worse, and the only acceptable way to age is to not appear to be doing so. This particularly affects women, who face much harsher judgment for visible aging than men do. This gender difference also comes from Viking frameworks. Men's value was tied to physical strength and leadership capacity, which could persist longer than the fertility and sexual attractiveness that determined women's value. An aging male warrior could still lead and command respect through experience and tactical knowledge. An aging woman who could no longer bear children and no longer fit beauty standards lost her primary social function and became marginal to a culture organised around reproduction and alliance building through marriage. We've retained this gender difference in how we judge ageing, with older men seen as distinguished and older women seen as invisible or unattractive, reflecting the original property value calculations of who is worth maintaining and who has lost their utility. The workplace age discrimination that makes it difficult for older workers to find employment operates on the same Viking logic. Employers want workers who are physically strong, mentally sharp, capable of maximum productivity, all qualities associated with youth. Older workers are assumed to be in decline, less energetic, less adaptable, less valuable, even when their experience and knowledge might make them more productive than younger workers. The Viking equation of worth with physical capacity persists, making older workers vulnerable to replacement by younger ones who are assumed to be more valuable simply by being younger. Perhaps most troubling is how this framework makes aging itself into a source of shame and anxiety. People dread birthdays, lie about their age, hide signs of aging, all because we've internalised the belief that getting older is getting worse, that aging is losing value as a human. This creates enormous psychological distress and prevents people from enjoying the actual benefits of aging. Accumulated knowledge, emotional maturity, freedom from some of the insecurities and pressures of youth. We've made what could be a time of wisdom and fulfillment into a period of decline and marginalisation, because we're following Viking resource allocation rules in a world of abundance where those rules are not just unnecessary but actively harmful. Here's the deep tragedy. The Vikings developed their attitude toward aging in a context of genuine scarcity, where keeping unproductive elderly people alive might actually threaten group survival. It was brutal but comprehensible given their constraints. We have no such excuse. We live in a world wealthy enough to support people regardless of their productive capacity, yet we've retained the Viking contempt for the elderly and weak, applying it not from necessity, but from cultural inertia. We make people feel worthless for aging. We marginalise and discriminate against them. We pressure them to hide or deny their age, all because we're following rules designed for a society that had to make impossible choices about who got to live and who had to die. We're still Vikings calculating resource allocation based on physical capacity, still treating the elderly as burdens rather than humans of worth, And we do it voluntarily, out of habit, because the cultural programming is too deep to see, let alone to challenge. Let us turn our attention now to a legal and social convention that shapes wealth distribution across generations in ways we rarely question. The practice of primogeniture, or more broadly, the assumption that inheritance should pass primarily to children, and among children should favour the eldest or the sons. When someone dies, we expect their property to go to their descendants, particularly their children. We treat this as natural, obvious, the way inheritance should work. Dying without a will and leaving everything to distant relatives while your children get nothing would be seen as bizarre, possibly evidence of mental illness or profound family dysfunction. The assumption that parents leave their wealth to their children, and that among children the eldest son often gets priority or a larger share, feels like it must reflect something fundamental about human families, about the natural bonds between parents and children, about ensuring continuity across generations. It reflects none of these universal human truths. It is a Viking property control system designed to prevent the fragmentation of estates and to maintain male power across generations, and we follow it so automatically that we've built our entire legal system of inheritance around assumptions that made sense only in a very specific historical context. Picture a Viking farmstead, hard-won from brutal land, maintained through generations of back-breaking labour. This farm is not just property, it is survival, identity, connection to ancestors, the foundation of family power and status. The household head knows that when he dies, his property will be divided, and he also knows that dividing property weakens everyone. If he has 4 sons and divides the farm into 4 equal parts, each son gets a quarter of what was needed to support one household comfortably. None of them will have enough land to maintain the status the family previously held. Each quarter farm is vulnerable to bad harvests, to raids, to the misfortunes that were survivable when you had more resources. Fragmentation means decline, potential disaster, the end of the family line as a force of significance in the community. The solution was primogeniture. All or most of the property went to the eldest son. The other sons got smaller portions, compensation in movable goods, or nothing at all. They were expected to make their own way, perhaps through raiding, through claiming new land elsewhere, through marrying into other families, through becoming retainers to more powerful men. This was harsh for younger sons, genuinely unfair in many ways, but it preserved the estate's integrity. The eldest son inherited enough to maintain the farm, the status, the power. He became the new household head, continuing the line in the position of authority that his father held. The farm didn't fragment into uselessness. The family maintained its standing. The cost was borne by younger sons who had to find other paths to security and status. Daughters were even more systematically excluded. A daughter who inherited property would typically transfer it to her husband's household upon marriage, meaning the property would leave the family entirely. This was unacceptable. The farm needed to stay in the male line, needed to remain under family control, needed to serve the continuity of the patrilineage. So daughters received dowries, portable property they took to their marriages, but they did not inherit land. The land went to sons, and primarily to the eldest son, ensuring that the family's territorial base remained intact and under male control. This system was not about fairness or about loving all children equally. It was about property preservation and power maintenance, a coldly calculated strategy for preventing the dissolution of estates across generations. It worked, from the perspective of estate preservation. Families that practice primogeniture maintained their holdings and their power over centuries. Families that divided property equally often saw their holdings fragment and their influence diminish within a few generations. The system was effective at what it was designed to do, even if what it was designed to do was deeply unjust to anyone who wasn't the eldest son. This practice spread throughout medieval Europe and became codified in law. By the high medieval period, most European aristocracies had legal primogeniture requirements. Titles and lands automatically passed to the eldest son. The younger sons got nothing or got minor provisions. This created the phenomenon of younger sons with aristocratic backgrounds but no inheritance, who became knights, crusaders, explorers, mercenaries, anything that might win them land and status they couldn't inherit. It created enormous social pressure on these dispossessed young men, driving them toward violence and conquest as the only viable paths to the security and status their elder brothers received by accident of birth order. The system also created the treatment of daughters as second-class family members whose primary value was in the alliances they could form through marriage rather than in their potential as inheritors and household heads. Modern inheritance law in most Western countries has moved away from strict legal primogeniture. You're no longer required to leave everything to your eldest son. But the cultural assumption that children should inherit, and that among children some might deserve more than others based on who they are rather than on their actual relationship with the deceased, persists powerfully. Estate planning advice still often focuses on children as the primary and assumed heirs. People who leave their estates to non-relatives, to charity, to friends rather than to their children, are often challenged legally and socially. The assumption is that something must be wrong. The deceased must have been mentally incompetent, unduly influenced, estranged from their family in problematic ways. The idea that someone might simply choose to direct their property to purposes they value rather than to their children is treated as aberrant, requiring explanation and justification. Even more telling is how we think about fairness in inheritance among children. Many parents struggle with whether to divide their estates equally or to give more to the child who needs more, to the child who provided care, to the child who continued the family business. The default assumption is equal division, but there's often an undercurrent feeling that the child who did more, who stayed closer, who carried on the family legacy, deserves more. This is Viking logic. Inheritance is about property continuity and family power maintenance, not about expressing love equally. The child who continues what the parents built, who stays connected to the family property and legacy, has a stronger claim than children who go their own way. We've tried to make this fair by defaulting to equal division, but the older logic still exerts pressure. The effect of this system is to make children's relationship with their parents partially about inheritance expectation, creating perverse incentives around end-of-life care, elder abuse, and family dynamics. Adult children who expect to inherit may make care decisions based on protecting their future inheritance, rather than on what's best for their aging parents. Parents may use inheritance as a control mechanism, threatening to disinherit children who displease them, rewarding compliance and punishing independence. The entire structure of late-life family relationships is distorted by the assumption that property should pass from parents to children, that children have some kind of claim on their parents' wealth, that dying without leaving an inheritance to your children is a failure or a punishment. But this assumption is Viking property preservation strategy, not a universal human truth. Many cultures have had and still have very different inheritance practices, property going to the community, to religious institutions, to whomever the deceased chooses regardless of family relationship. The Viking system is not inevitable or natural. It's a choice, one we've made and continue to make, that prioritises property continuity and male power over individual choice and genuine fairness. Here's what should disturb you. We've built our legal system of inheritance around Viking priorities that most modern people don't actually share. Most people don't think eldest sons should get more than younger children, don't think daughters should be excluded, don't think property preservation should override individual wishes. Yet our laws, our cultural expectations, our family dynamics are all still shaped by these Viking assumptions. We follow rules designed to maintain estates and male power in a subsistence agricultural economy, applying them to modern contexts where they create as many problems as they solve, and we do it without questioning whether these are the rules we would choose if we were building an inheritance system from scratch, rather than inheriting one from people who thought of daughters as property to be transferred and younger sons as expendable. Consider now one of the most powerful and least questioned social obligations in Western culture: the expectation that you must welcome guests into your home, that refusing hospitality is a serious offence, that once someone is under your roof, you have obligations to protect and care for them, even if you dislike or distrust them. We talk about the sacredness of hospitality, about house guests being entitled to certain treatment, about the host's duty to make guests comfortable. Violating these expectations, refusing to let someone stay with you when they've travelled to visit, throwing someone out of your home without serious provocation, failing to provide adequate food and accommodation to people you've invited, these are seen as profound moral failures, evidence of bad character, potential relationship-ending offences. This conviction that hospitality is sacred and that hosts have obligations to guests feels like basic human decency, like the kind of mutual support that makes civilization possible. And in some ways it is. But the specific form our hospitality obligations take, the intensity of the social pressure around them, the sense that refusing hospitality is almost supernaturally wrong. These come from a Viking legal and religious system where hospitality wasn't kindness, but rather survival insurance, and where violating hospitality rules could literally get you killed by human or supernatural forces. Picture a Viking travelling through hostile territory, perhaps trading, perhaps on a diplomatic mission, perhaps fleeing from enemies. The distances between settlements were vast, the wilderness was dangerous, and there were no inns, no hotels, no infrastructure for travellers. Your survival depended on finding households willing to take you in for the night, to give you food and shelter, to protect you from the elements and from whatever threats haunted the darkness. Refusing to offer hospitality to a traveller who requested it was more than rude. It was essentially condemning them to possible death. The Vikings developed elaborate rules around hospitality that made it a sacred obligation. When a traveller arrived at your door and requested shelter, you were required to take them in, feed them, provide them a place to sleep and protect them while they were under your roof. This wasn't optional. It was a religious and legal requirement enforced by both social pressure and supernatural threat. The gods, particularly Thor, were believed to sometimes travel in disguise, testing mortals' hospitality. If you refused a traveller and that traveller turned out to be a god, the consequences would be catastrophic. Divine curse, ruined crops, dead livestock, family disaster. You could never be certain that the ragged stranger at your door wasn't actually Thor testing your virtue, so you had to assume every traveller might be divine and treat them accordingly. This created a system where refusing hospitality was extraordinarily risky. The immediate social consequences were severe. You'd be marked as inhospitable, untrustworthy, someone who violated sacred custom. Other households might refuse you hospitality in turn when you needed it. Your reputation would suffer in ways that affected your legal standing and economic opportunities. But worse than the social consequences were the supernatural ones. The gods would punish you for refusing hospitality, and this punishment might come immediately or might be delayed, might strike you or might strike your descendants. But it would come as certain as winter. The sagas are filled with stories of people who refused travellers and suffered terrible fates as a result. Their halls burning down, their children dying, their luck turning bad in ways that could only be explained as divine retribution. Conversely, offering generous hospitality brought divine favour. The traveller you helped might turn out to be a god in disguise, who would reward your generosity with blessings, gifts, protection. Even if the traveller was just an ordinary human, the gods saw your hospitality and credited you with virtue that would be repaid in your hour of need. Hospitality was an investment in supernatural goodwill, insurance against the day when you might be the traveller seeking shelter, when you might need the gods' protection, when your generosity would be remembered and reciprocated. But there was a dark side to this hospitality system, a a set of obligations that created as many dangers as they resolved. Once someone was under your roof, once you had accepted them as a guest, you became responsible for their safety. If they were attacked while staying with you, if they were murdered by other guests or by members of your household, you shared in the guilt and could be held legally responsible. This created enormous pressure to maintain peace in your hall, to prevent violence even when your guests were mortal enemies who would kill each other the moment they left your protection. The sagas feature numerous stories of hosts struggling to keep feuding guests from murdering each other at the dinner table, knowing that any violence would stain the host's honour and bring supernatural curse upon the household. More sinister was the concept of guest right violation, the idea that murdering someone who had eaten your food and slept under your roof was one of the most serious crimes possible, offences against both human law and divine order. Yet this violation happened, usually when the temptation to kill an enemy was too strong to resist despite the protection of hospitality. The famous Red Wedding from modern fiction is based on historical incidents where hosts murdered guests despite the sacred protections, acts so shocking that they were remembered for centuries as examples of ultimate treachery. The perpetrators were seen as cursed, damned both legally and spiritually, but sometimes the strategic advantage of killing your enemy when they were vulnerable outweighed even these terrible consequences. This entire system of hospitality obligations, supernatural enforcement and sacred guest right has been transmitted to modern culture with surprisingly little modification. We still feel that refusing hospitality is wrong in ways that refusing other requests for help is not. We still treat guests as having special claims on our resources and protection while they're in our homes. We still consider violations of hospitality, throwing someone out suddenly, mistreating people who are staying with you, refusing to help someone who's travelled to see you, as serious moral offences that can permanently damage relationships and reputations. But the context has completely changed. We have hotels, we have infrastructure for travellers, we have emergency services and social support systems. No one dies from being refused hospitality in the way Vikings might have. Yet we maintain the Viking level of moral intensity around these obligations, creating enormous stress and potential for abuse. Houseguests who overstay their welcome, who behave badly, who take advantage of hospitality, are extraordinarily difficult to remove because the host feels bound by obligations that make asking someone to leave feel like a profound violation of sacred duty. People endure uncomfortable, even damaging houseguest situations because the cultural programming says you cannot refuse hospitality. You cannot throw someone out once you've accepted them. You must endure whatever they do while under your roof. The flip side is equally problematic. Guests who feel entitled to hospitality, who expect to be accommodated regardless of the inconvenience to the host, who treat a request to stay as something the host cannot refuse without serious relationship damage. The Viking system where refusing hospitality could mean death has morphed into a social structure, where refusing hospitality means you're a bad person, a bad friend, a bad family member, even when the request is unreasonable or the guest's behaviour is unacceptable. We've retained the intensity of the obligation while losing the survival context that made it make sense. Perhaps most disturbing is how this plays out in situations of actual danger. People allow potentially dangerous individuals into their homes because refusing feels wrong, because the hospitality obligation overrides reasonable caution. Domestic violence situations are sometimes prolonged because the victim feels obligated to continue offering hospitality to the abuser, because kicking someone out of the home you share feels like a violation of sacred duty. The guest right concept, originally designed to protect travellers from host violence, gets inverted to protect abusive guests from being expelled by hosts who have every reason to want them gone. We're following Viking hospitality rules in a world where they're no longer necessary for survival, but still powerful enough to override our own safety and comfort, and we rarely stop to ask whether these are the obligations we would choose if we weren't following a script written for people who might die in the wilderness if they were refused a night's shelter, Let us examine now a practice that shapes our daily routines and our judgments of others in profound ways. The expectation that people should bathe regularly, that clean bodies and clean clothes are markers of respectability and morality, that uncleanliness is shameful and disgusting. We teach children that they must bathe, brush their teeth, wash their hands, maintain their bodies in states of scrupulous cleanliness. Adults who smell bad or appear dirty face social ostracism, employment discrimination, judgment as lazy or mentally ill. The association between cleanliness and virtue is so strong that we describe good people as clean, bad people as dirty, moral purity as cleanliness, moral corruption as filth. This equation of physical cleanliness with moral worth feels natural, obviously correct, probably rooted in basic biology and disease prevention. It is none of these things. It is a Viking social hierarchy marker that we've universalized into a moral requirement, and understanding this should make us deeply uncomfortable about who we judge and why. Picture early medieval Europe, particularly the regions under Roman influence, where bathing was infrequent, where most people washed minimally, where the elaborate bathing culture of the Romans had collapsed along with their infrastructure. Into this context came the Vikings, who were obsessive about bathing by contemporary standards. They bathed at least once a week, often more frequently. They had saunas, bathhouses, elaborate grooming rituals. They washed their hair, combed it carefully, maintained their beards, changed their clothes regularly. Arab traders who encountered Vikings commented with surprise on their cleanliness and grooming habits, noting that Vikings washed their hands and faces daily, which was apparently remarkable enough to document. Why were the Vikings so clean when their contemporaries were not? The answer is partly practical. In cold climates, regular bathing and clean clothes help prevent skin diseases and parasite infestations that could be deadly. But the answer is more fundamentally social. Cleanliness was a status marker, a way of distinguishing free people from slaves, wealthy people from poor people, people who mattered from people who didn't. A free Viking who owned their own household, who had resources and status, demonstrated this through their cleanliness. They could afford the fuel to heat water for bathing. They could afford multiple sets of clothes to change into while others were being washed. They could afford the time for elaborate grooming when they weren't desperately scrambling for survival. Cleanliness proved you were free, you were prosperous, you were worth paying attention to. Slaves, conversely, were kept deliberately dirty. They were not allowed to bathe as frequently, not given clean clothes, not permitted the grooming implements and practices that free people used. This served multiple purposes. First, it made slaves immediately identifiable. You could tell at a glance who was enslaved and who was free based on their level of cleanliness and grooming. Second, it dehumanized slaves, marking them as fundamentally different from free people, as closer to animals than to humans. Animals are dirty, humans are clean. Therefore, dirty people are more like animals, less deserving of human treatment and rights. The logic was circular and self-reinforcing. Third, denying slaves the dignity of cleanliness was a form of control and humiliation, a daily reminder of their degraded status and their powerlessness to change it. The association between cleanliness and freedom, between dirtiness and slavery, became deeply embedded in Viking culture and spread throughout medieval Europe. Being clean meant you were free and respectable. Being dirty meant you were enslaved, poor, or criminal. In any case, someone of a low status who could be treated accordingly. This marker was so powerful that free people who fell into poverty and could no longer maintain cleanliness standards would sometimes be assumed to be of servile status, losing social standing and legal protections because they no longer looked like free people. The Christian Church adopted and reinforced these cleanliness standards, though with some modification. Cleanliness became associated not just with social status, but with spiritual purity. The unclean were not just poor or enslaved. They were sinful, morally corrupt, tainted by association with filth and degradation. This added a spiritual dimension to what had been primarily a social marker, making dirtiness not just low status but actually evil, and making cleanliness not just high status but virtuous and godly. This framework persisted through subsequent centuries and intensified during the Victorian era, when cleanliness standards became even more elaborate and moralistic. The Victorians preached cleanliness is next to godliness, explicitly connecting physical cleanliness with moral worth. They developed extensive hygiene rituals, built elaborate bathing infrastructure, created whole industries around soap and cleanliness products. They also used cleanliness standards to justify colonialism and racism. Colonised peoples and racial minorities were characterised as dirty, unclean, therefore inferior, and in need of civilising by clean, superior Europeans. The Viking association between cleanliness and status became the Victorian and then modern association between cleanliness and civilization, with dirtiness marking you as savage, primitive, subhuman. We've inherited this entire framework. We judge people's worth based on their cleanliness. We assume that people who smell bad or appear dirty are lazy, mentally ill, morally deficient or otherwise problematic. We rarely consider that they might be homeless without access to bathing facilities, working multiple jobs without time for grooming, suffering from physical disabilities that make hygiene difficult, or simply from cultures with different cleanliness standards. We apply Viking status markers without acknowledging that's what we're doing, treating our particular cleanliness standards as universal and obvious, rather than as culturally specific and historically contingent. The effect is to create a permanent underclass of people who cannot meet cleanliness standards and are therefore judged as less human, less deserving of respect and opportunity. Homeless people are perhaps the clearest example. Unable to bathe regularly or maintain clean clothes, they are treated with disgust and dismissed as dirty, with their dirtiness used to justify denying them access to public spaces, employment, housing, basic human dignity. We're doing exactly what the Vikings did to slaves, using enforced dirtiness to mark people as less than human, then treating them as less than human because they're dirty. The cycle is identical and just as dehumanizing, but we've convinced ourselves it's about hygiene and standards rather than about maintaining social hierarchy through arbitrary markers. Even among people with access to bathing facilities, cleanliness standards function as class markers. The person who showers once a week is judged more harshly than the person who showers twice daily, even though once a week is probably adequate for health. The person who wears clothes multiple times before washing them is seen as slightly suspect, even though this is better for the environment and the longevity of the clothes. We've created cleanliness standards far beyond what's necessary for health or comfort, and we use these excessive standards to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable people, between people who deserve respect and people who don't. Here's what should disturb you. We're using Viking slave marking techniques to create a modern hierarchy of human worth. We've taken a system designed to identify and dehumanize enslaved people, universalized it into a moral requirement, and now use it to judge and exclude anyone who doesn't or can't meet our arbitrary cleanliness standards. We do this while believing we're just being hygienic, just maintaining reasonable standards, never recognizing that we're following a script designed to mark some people as subhuman and therefore undeserving of basic dignity and rights. The person you avoid on the bus because they smell, the job applicant you reject because they look unkempt, the homeless person you dismiss as dirty, you're treating them exactly as Vikings treated slaves, using cleanliness as a marker of who counts as fully human, and you're doing it while thinking you're just being reasonable about hygiene. That's how completely the Viking framework has colonised our thinking. We've turned their slave marking system into our moral standard, and we defend it as natural and good. Consider now a practice so embedded in Western social life that entire industries exist to support it. The culture of social drinking, particularly the expectation that alcohol should be present at celebrations, that refusing to drink alcohol is socially awkward and requires explanation, that bonding and relaxation are properly facilitated by ethanol consumption. We toast at weddings, we drink at parties, we meet friends at bars, we have wine. With dinner, we celebrate successes with champagne. The person who doesn't drink faces constant questions, pressure to make exceptions, judgment as uptight or boring. The assumption is that normal, healthy adults drink alcohol in social contexts, and that abstaining requires a reason, medical, religious, addiction recovery, that excuses the deviation from normal social behaviour. This treatment of alcohol as central to social life feels modern, perhaps related to contemporary party culture or advertising pressure. It is ancient, specifically Viking, and understanding why the Vikings drank socially should make us question whether we want to continue following their example. Picture a Viking feast in a cold, dark hall during the long northern winter. The days are brutally short, the work is done for the season, and the community gathers in the hall to pass the time until spring allows outdoor activity to resume. The psychological challenges are significant. Close quarters, limited activity, darkness, cold, the stress of living in proximity to people you might not particularly like, but cannot escape until spring. The Vikings solved this problem partially through organised drinking, creating rituals around alcohol consumption that served specific social functions. First, alcohol was a social lubricant that reduced inhibitions and made people more willing to interact in friendly ways despite underlying tensions. Vikings drank in groups, not alone, and the drinking was structured around toasts, songs, storytelling, activities that created shared experience and reinforced social bonds. The alcohol made it easier to forget grievances, to laugh together, to feel temporarily connected despite conflicts that would resurface when sober. This was practical social technology for maintaining group cohesion under difficult circumstances. Second, alcohol served as a safety valve for aggression and status competition. Vikings could not actually fight each other during the winter without threatening group survival. Killing or seriously injuring community members when spring planting would require all available labour was a disaster. But they could compete through drinking, through who could consume the most without passing out, through verbal contests and boasting while drunk. These competitions were sometimes violent and always status determining, but they channeled aggression into forms that were less immediately lethal than actual combat. Third, and most importantly, alcohol created a context where normal social rules were suspended. Things said while drunk could be dismissed as ale talk, not binding, not requiring the formal responses that sober insults would demand. People could express grievances, test ideas, make proposals they could later disavow, all under the protective cover of intoxication. The drinking hall became a space where social experimentation was possible, where the rigid honour codes and reputation management that governed sober interaction could be temporarily relaxed. But there was a dark side to this drinking culture. Alcohol consumption was not optional. Refusing to drink when drink was offered was a serious insult to the host, a rejection of community, a suggestion that you didn't trust the drink or the company. You had to drink to be part of the social group, to maintain your status, to demonstrate your belonging. The person who didn't drink was suspect, possibly plotting, possibly holding themselves apart from the community in ways that suggested disloyalty or hostility. Drinking together created vulnerability. You were impaired, less able to fight, more honest than strategic. This vulnerability was mutual and therefore bonding, but only if everyone participated. The person who stayed sober while others drank was dangerous, capable of taking advantage of others' impairment, potentially gathering information that others would not share if everyone was sober. Additionally, the Viking drinking culture encouraged excess. Moderation was not valued. Drinking to the point of losing consciousness was common, and sometimes celebrated as evidence of commitment to the celebration. The sagas mention people drinking so heavily they couldn't walk, had to be carried to bed, suffered injuries from falling while intoxicated. This was treated as normal, even admirable in some contexts, evidence that you were fully committed to the feast, not holding back, not protecting yourself from the vulnerability that drinking created. The medical consequences were severe: alcoholism, liver disease, death from acute alcohol poisoning. But these were accepted as prices worth paying for the social benefits that drinking provided. This drinking culture spread throughout medieval Europe and became encoded in social expectations that persist today. We've softened some elements. We don't typically drink to unconsciousness at modern social gatherings, at least not deliberately, but the core pattern remains. Alcohol is expected at celebrations. Refusing alcohol requires explanation and often creates awkwardness. Drinking together is seen as bonding and normal. Abstaining is seen as uptight or problematic. We've retained the Viking conviction that social drinking is necessary for community and celebration, that alcohol facilitates connection in ways that sober interaction cannot. But consider what we've actually inherited: a social pattern designed for people trapped together through brutal winters, who needed chemical assistance to tolerate each other's company, a pattern that treated alcohol dependency as normal and even admirable, a pattern that made drinking participation a test of loyalty and belonging. We're following these rules in context where they're not necessary. We're not trapped together. We have other entertainment options. We could socialise perfectly well without alcohol. Yet we maintain the Viking intensity around social drinking, creating enormous pressure to participate, judging people who abstain, treating alcohol as though it's necessary for celebration, when it's actually just traditional for reasons we've forgotten. The pressure to drink affects people in recovery from addiction, people with medical conditions that make alcohol dangerous, people whose religious beliefs prohibit alcohol, people who simply prefer not to drink. All of these people face constant social pressure, constant questions, constant judgment for deviating from the Viking norm that drinking together is what community does. We've made Viking coping mechanisms for winter isolation into universal social requirements, applying them even in contexts where they make no sense and actively harm people. Perhaps most concerning is how this drinking culture normalises alcohol dependency and hides problem drinking. When heavy drinking is standard at social gatherings, when drinking to excess is celebrated or at least tolerated, when abstaining is seen as more abnormal than daily drinking, it becomes very difficult to recognise when drinking has become destructive. The person who drinks heavily at every social occasion is following normal behaviour according to Viking standards, even if they're developing alcoholism according to medical standards. The culture makes it hard to see the problem until it's severe, and even then the social expectation is that the person should be able to drink normally rather than that they should stop drinking entirely. Here's what should disturb you. We're following drinking protocols designed for people who had no other way to cope with being trapped in close quarters for months at a time, applying them to modern contexts where we have countless alternatives for socialising and celebrating. We've turned Viking survival drinking into a social requirement, making people feel abnormal for choosing not to consume a addictive neurotoxin, judging them for failing to participate in a ritual that originated as a way to reduce violence during forced proximity in harsh climates. We're Vikings drinking through the winter dark, except it's not winter and we're not trapped. And we're doing it anyway because the cultural programming is too strong to resist, even when we can see that it's harming us. Let us turn now to practices surrounding death and burial, particularly the belief that the dead must be treated with elaborate respect, that funerals should be expensive and formal, that failure to give someone a proper burial is a profound moral failing. We spend thousands on funerals, on caskets that will never be seen again, on cemetery plots and headstones, on flowers that will wilt within days. Families go into debt to provide funerals they believe are required to honour their dead. The funeral industry has become a multi-billion-dollar enterprise built on the conviction that the dead deserve and require specific expensive treatment. Choosing cheaper alternatives, direct cremation, green burial, donating the body to science, often produces guilt and judgment, as though you're dishonouring the deceased by refusing to spend money on them. This conviction that the dead require expensive formal ritual feels like respect, like love, like the minimum we owe to people we cared about. It is a Viking supernatural anxiety about the dead returning to harm the living, and we're spending fortunes on protections we don't actually believe we need. Picture a Viking community dealing with death in a culture where the line between living and dead was dangerously permeable. The Vikings believed in Draga, the undead, corpses that could reanimate and walk if not properly handled. These weren't the shambling zombies of modern fiction. They were strong, intelligent, malevolent beings who emerged from their graves to terrorize the living, killing people, destroying property, spreading disease and misfortune. The Draugr was one of the most feared supernatural threats in Norse culture, and preventing the creation of Draugr required careful treatment of corpses and elaborate burial rituals. The burial had to prevent the dead from returning. This meant several things. The body needed to be prepared properly, washed, dressed, sometimes bound or weighted down to make movement difficult. It needed to be buried with items it might need in the afterlife, so it wouldn't need to return to the world of the living to retrieve them. Weapons, tools, food, valuable goods were buried with the dead, not primarily to honour them, but to keep them satisfied and stationary. A dead person who had everything they needed would stay in their grave. A dead person who felt deprived or insulted would come back to claim what they were owed. The burial location mattered enormously. Bodies were sometimes buried at crossroads, under heavy stones, in remote locations far from settlements. These practices weren't about giving the dead a nice resting place. They were about making it difficult for them to find their way back to the living. The crossroads confused them. The stones trapped them. The distance exhausted them before they could reach inhabited areas. Some bodies, particularly of people who were considered likely to become dangerous Draugr, criminals, those who died violently, those who were unpopular or suspected of magical ability, were buried face down, so if they did try to claw their way out, they'd dig deeper into the earth rather than toward the surface. The funeral feast was equally important, but not for the reasons modern people assume. The feast wasn't just about celebrating the deceased's life or comforting the mourners. It was about creating obligations between the dead and the living. By holding a feast in the dead person's honour, by consuming food and drink in their name, the living created a debt the dead owed them. The dead were expected to be grateful for the funeral honours, to remember the respect shown to them, to refrain from harming the living who had treated them properly. The funeral feast was transactional. We give you honour, you stay in your grave and don't kill us. Everyone understood this exchange. Skimping on the funeral, refusing to provide proper burial, failing to hold the required feast and observances, these were dangerous mistakes that would result in supernatural retaliation. The improperly buried dead would return, would haunt their families, would bring misfortune and death as punishment for the disrespect shown to them. The sagas are filled with stories of people who cheaped out on funerals and suffered terrible consequences. Their crops failed, their animals died, family members were killed by the vengeful Draugr of the person they'd failed to bury properly. The message was clear: spend what's necessary on the dead, or they will take much more from you as revenge. This created enormous social pressure to provide expensive, elaborate funerals, even when families could barely afford them. You couldn't save money on burial without essentially inviting supernatural disaster. The community watched and judged. A cheap funeral suggested you didn't care about the deceased, didn't fear their potential return, were willing to risk everyone's safety by angering the dead. Such callousness marked you as suspect, potentially dangerous, someone who would cut corners on sacred obligations and thereby threaten collective safety. The Christian Church adopted and intensified these funeral requirements, adding new theological justifications. Proper burial became not just about preventing the dead from walking, but about ensuring their souls reached heaven, about demonstrating Christian charity and respect for the body as a temple that would be resurrected. The Church also benefited financially from elaborate funerals, fees for burial in consecrated ground, payments for masses for the deceased soul, donations for prayers and rituals. The church had strong incentive to maintain the belief that expensive funerals were morally required, and they preached this effectively. This framework persisted through centuries and became the foundation of the modern funeral industry. We no longer believe in Draugr, no longer think the dead will literally rise from their graves to attack us if we bury them cheaply. But we've retained the emotional conviction that the dead require expensive ritual, that skimping on funerals is wrong and dangerous, that proper treatment of the dead demands significant financial sacrifice. The funeral industry has built itself on these Viking anxieties, selling caskets and services and cemetery plots at enormous markups while invoking the language of respect, honour and love to pressure grieving families into overspending. The effect is to make death financially devastating. Families who can't afford elaborate funerals feel they're failing their loved ones, dishonouring them, doing something shameful. They go into debt, they forgo other necessities, they sacrifice their own financial security to provide funerals that will satisfy social expectations. Expectations that trace directly back to Viking fear of the walking dead. We're buying protection from Draugr we don't believe in, following rules designed to keep corpses in their graves in a world where corpses provably stay in their graves regardless of how much money we spend on their burial. Perhaps most troubling is how this affects grief and mourning. Instead of being able to focus on their loss and their memories, grieving families are immediately pressured into making expensive decisions about caskets, burial plots, funeral services, all while in a state of emotional vulnerability that makes them easy targets for industry upselling. The focus shifts from processing grief to performing proper respect through financial expenditure, as though love for the deceased can and should be measured by what you spend on their burial. This is pure Viking transactional thinking about the dead. You owe them proper funeral. Proper funeral costs money. Therefore spending money proves you cared and protect you from their potential vengeance. Modern alternatives exist: direct cremation, green burial, body donation, that are cheaper, often more environmentally sound and arguably more rational. But people who choose these alternatives often face judgment and guilt, as though they're being disrespectful or cheap, as though they're dishonouring the dead by refusing to follow the expensive Viking protocol that the funeral industry has successfully maintained for over a millennium. We're trapped by cultural programming designed to prevent Draugr attacks, spending thousands to protect ourselves from threats we know don't exist, and calling it love and respect when it's really just ancient supernatural anxiety that we cannot shake no matter how much we consciously recognise its irrationality. Consider now one of the foundational assumptions of modern Western life: the belief that owning your own home is a crucial life goal, that renting is somehow inferior or temporary, that property ownership is tied to adult success and security. We describe home ownership as the American dream, as building equity, as investing in your future. Young people feel pressure to buy homes even when renting might be financially wiser. People who rent long-term are sometimes seen as failing to launch, as not fully adult, as somehow less stable or successful than homeowners. This conviction that property ownership is the proper goal of adult life feels natural, economically rational, obviously correct. It is Viking territorial claim behaviour transplanted to modern contexts, where it often makes no economic sense, and understanding this should make us question whether home ownership deserves the sacred status we've given it. Picture a Viking who has spent years raiding, trading or working, accumulating wealth in portable form, silver, goods, treasure. This wealth is vulnerable. It can be stolen, lost, spent. It doesn't reproduce itself or generate ongoing value. The Viking wants security, wants a foundation for family and future, wants to transform portable wealth into permanent claim on territory. The solution is to buy or claim land, to build a farmstead, to establish a physical presence on territory that can be defended, worked and passed to descendants. This isn't just about having a place to live, it's about establishing a territorial claim that comes with legal rights, social status and long-term security. The land you own cannot be easily taken from you. In Viking culture, owning land gave you legal standing, the right to participate in the Thing assembly, the right to vote on community decisions, the right to have your testimony counted in legal disputes. A landless man, no matter how wealthy in portable goods, lacked this legal status. He was essentially a perpetual guest on others' territory, vulnerable to being expelled, unable to participate fully in governance and law. Land ownership was the difference between being a full member of society and being a marginal figure with limited rights and protections. Additionally, owned land could be worked to generate ongoing wealth. A farmstead produced food, supported livestock, created surplus that could be traded or stored against hard times. Land was productive wealth rather than static wealth, an investment that, if properly maintained, would support you and your descendants indefinitely. The Vikings saw land ownership as the ultimate goal of wealth accumulation. You raided and traded to get enough portable wealth to buy land, and once you owned land, you had achieved security and status that portable wealth alone could never provide. This created intense cultural pressure to own land. The landless were pitied or scorned, seen as incomplete adults who had failed to achieve the fundamental goal of establishing themselves on territory. Renting land from others, being a tenant farmer or a landless labourer, was a low-status position that you were expected to escape as quickly as possible. Success was measured by land ownership. The more land you owned, the more successful and powerful you were. A great chieftain owned vast territories, controlled many farmsteads, had numerous tenants working land he owned. A poor man owned perhaps a small plot barely sufficient to support his family. But even the poor landowner had more status and legal standing than the landless, regardless of how much portable wealth the landless person might possess. This framework spread throughout medieval Europe and became encoded in legal and social systems. Land ownership determined who could vote, who had legal rights, who could participate in governance. The landless were excluded from political power, from legal protections that landed people enjoyed, from the social status that came with property ownership. This persisted well into the modern era. Property requirements for voting were common in Western democracies into the 19th and even 20th centuries in some places. The Viking equation of land ownership with full citizenship and social standing became the foundation of modern property law and social expectation. We've inherited this framework almost unchanged. Home ownership is treated as a fundamental goal of adult life, as evidence of success and stability. People who rent are often seen as transient, not fully settled, not as invested in their communities as homeowners. Politicians and economists treat increasing home ownership rates as policy goals, as evidence of economic health and opportunity. The entire system of mortgages, property tax deductions, housing policy is built on the assumption that people should own their homes, that this is the natural and proper state of affairs. But this assumption is Viking territorial logic that often doesn't make sense in modern economic contexts. For many people, renting is financially wiser than owning. It provides flexibility, avoids maintenance costs and property tax, allows capital to be invested in higher return assets rather than tied up in housing equity. Yet people buy homes anyway, often at the limits of what they can afford because the cultural pressure to own property is too strong to resist. They buy homes in locations they might want to leave, in markets where prices are artificially inflated, with mortgages that stress their finances, all because home ownership is treated as the proper goal even when it's economically suboptimal. The psychological effects are significant. Homeowners feel more settled, more adult, more successful than renters, even when their actual financial situations are worse. Renters feel inadequate, temporary, as though they haven't fully achieved adult status, even when renting is the rational choice for their circumstances. We've attached Viking status markers to home ownership, making it about identity and worth, rather than about practical housing needs, and this distorts decision-making in destructive ways. Moreover, the obsession with home ownership has created housing market bubbles, financial crises, and wealth inequality. When everyone feels they must own property to be successful, demand for housing inflates prices beyond what's economically rational. Banks profit from this by offering mortgages to people who can barely afford them, knowing that the cultural imperative to own property will drive people to take on dangerous levels of debt. The 2008 financial crisis was partly caused by this dynamic. People overstretching financially to buy homes they couldn't really afford, because home ownership was treated as necessary rather than optional, as a right, rather than as one possible housing choice among several. The cultural sacred status of home ownership also affects housing policy in ways that exacerbate inequality. Homeowners vote against new housing development that might lower their property values, creating artificial scarcity that drives up prices and makes housing unaffordable for younger and poorer people. Zoning laws, building restrictions, neighbourhood opposition to density, all are driven partly by homeowners protecting their investments that are treated as sacred because of Viking assumptions about land ownership being tied to status and citizenship. The result is housing crises in many cities, with skyrocketing rents and home prices making it impossible for ordinary people to afford housing, all while homeowners oppose the policy changes that would increase supply and lower prices. Here's what should disturb you. We're treating home ownership as a sacred goal, because Vikings needed land ownership to have legal rights and social standing in a subsistence agricultural economy. We've retained this framework in a modern economy, where home ownership is often financially suboptimal, and where the legal rights and social standing of citizens are not supposed to depend on property ownership. We've created enormous financial pressure, debt, and inequality by following Viking land claim logic in contexts where it makes no sense, and we defend it as natural and necessary when it's actually just cultural programming that serves the interests of banks and existing homeowners while harming renters and would-be buyers. We're still Vikings claiming territory to establish legal standing and social status, except we don't need land ownership for these things anymore, and we're doing it anyway, bankrupting ourselves to follow rules from a world where the landless had no rights, and where the only path to security was territorial claim. Let us conclude our examination of Viking rules. We still follow with perhaps the most pervasive and least questioned, the structure of our annual calendar around seasonal celebrations, particularly the winter holiday season. Christmas, New Year's, the entire period from late December through early January is treated as sacred time, a period when normal work stops. Families must gather, gifts must be exchanged, elaborate meals must be prepared, decorations must be displayed. The person who works through the holidays is pitied or judged as lonely and sad. The person who doesn't celebrate is seen as strange, perhaps hostile to community values. The pressure to participate in holiday celebrations is enormous, and opting out creates social consequences. This treatment of winter holidays as mandatory, as the most important time of year, as requiring family gathering and gift exchange and feasting, feels like it must reflect something universal about human nature, about the importance of family, about marking the passage of time. It reflects Viking survival strategies for making it through winter without killing each other, and we've retained the structure while forgetting why it was necessary. Picture a Viking household in the depths of winter, when the days are brutally short, when outdoor work is impossible, when the community is trapped together in close quarters for months. The psychological challenges are extreme. The darkness alone is oppressive, affecting mood and energy in ways that modern people with electric lights can barely imagine. The inactivity is frustrating for people accustomed to constant physical labour. The close proximity with limited privacy creates friction and conflict. The uncertainty about whether food stores will last until spring creates anxiety. Without deliberate intervention, winter could easily descend into violence, depression, and social breakdown. The Vikings addressed this through Jol, the winter solstice celebration that would eventually be merged with and transformed into Christmas. Jol was not primarily about religion, or even about celebration in the modern sense. It was a carefully designed social technology for surviving winter psychologically intact. The timing was crucial. The solstice, the darkest point of the year, when days would begin to lengthen again, when the worst of winter was still ahead but the turning point towards spring had been reached. This was when people most needed hope, needed distraction, needed reasons to believe they would survive. The celebration lasted for days, sometimes weeks, creating an extended period of altered routine. Normal work stopped, which was practical since there was little work that could be done in midwinter anyway. But the cessation was ritualized, made into a deliberate choice rather than forced inactivity. Feasting was central, consuming stored food lavishly, demonstrating abundance even in the season of potential scarcity, creating the psychological experience of plenty rather than lack. This was risky from a practical standpoint. Eating too much of your winter stores could mean running out before spring, but the psychological benefit of the feast apparently outweighed the risk. People who had eaten well and felt temporarily secure were more likely to cooperate and less likely to turn on each other during the remainder of winter. Gift exchange served specific functions. It created and reinforced social bonds through reciprocity obligations. It demonstrated generosity and status. Those who gave impressive gifts proved they had resources and power. It redistributed goods within the community, ensuring that those with less received needed items from those with more, though framed as gift rather than as charity to preserve everyone's dignity. The exchange was not optional or casual. It was a required ritual that everyone participated in, creating a web of obligations and connections that would carry the community through the remaining months of enforced proximity. The gathering of extended family and community was similarly functional. It broke the monotony of household isolation, provided new conversation and interaction, reminded people that they were part of a larger group that extended beyond the immediate household they'd been trapped with for weeks. It also allowed for dispute resolution, for matchmaking for marriages that would occur in the spring, for political alliance building and negotiation that needed to happen face to face. The feast brought people together who might not otherwise see each other during winter, creating opportunities for social maintenance that would otherwise have to wait until spring. Importantly, Joel also involved elements of inversion and release. Normal social hierarchies might be temporarily relaxed. Slaves might participate in some feast activities. Women might have more voice than usual. Young people might be allowed behaviours that would ordinarily be punished. This controlled chaos served as a pressure release, allowing people to express frustrations and push against boundaries in contexts where the violations would not permanently disrupt social order. When the feast ended, normal hierarchy was restored, but the temporary inversion had allowed people to blow off steam that might otherwise have built to destructive levels. The Christian Church encountered Joel when converting Scandinavia and made the strategic decision to merge it with Christmas rather than trying to eliminate it. The theological justification changed. Now you were celebrating the birth of Christ rather than the solstice, but the structure remained identical. The timing stayed the same, the feasting continued, the gift exchange persisted, the family gathering was maintained. The church added religious observances, but these were layered onto the existing Viking framework rather than replacing it. The result was a Christianized version of a pagan survival festival, retaining all the practical social functions while adding new spiritual meaning. This hybrid celebration spread throughout Christian Europe and eventually worldwide. We've modernized the trappings, electric lights instead of candles, industrial gifts instead of handmade items, restaurants and grocery stores instead of preserved food stores. But the core structure is unchanged. Winter holidays remain a mandatory period of work cessation, family gathering, gift exchange and feasting. The social pressure to participate remains intense. The sense that this is the most important time of year, that missing these celebrations is a serious loss, persists. We're following the Viking winter survival protocol in contexts where we're not trapped together by weather, where we have entertainment and communication options they couldn't imagine, where the psychological challenges of winter are vastly reduced by modern technology and infrastructure. Yet we maintain their intensity around winter celebration, as though we still needed this ritual to prevent social breakdown during forced proximity. Consider the dysfunction this creates. Families who don't actually enjoy each other's company feel obligated to gather, creating tense, unhappy holidays. People go into debt to buy gifts, following the Viking reciprocity requirements, even when the exchange brings no genuine pleasure. Workers who would prefer to work during the holiday period are judged as sad or workaholics for deviating from mandatory celebration. The entire structure assumes that everyone shares the same needs, the same family situations, the same desire for the winter gathering that Vikings required for survival, but that many modern people find stressful rather than sustaining. The commercialization of Christmas is often blamed on modern capitalism, but the gift exchange requirement is ancient, Viking, built into the structure from the beginning. What's changed is not the obligation to give gifts, but the scale and expense of the gifts, driven by the combination of Viking reciprocity requirements with industrial production capacity and advertising pressure. We're still performing the same ritual, demonstrating status through generous gifts, creating obligations through exchange, redistributing resources through ritualized giving, but doing it with manufactured goods bought with borrowed money instead of handmade items and preserved food. The environmental impact of modern Christmas, the waste, the consumption, the carbon footprint of travel and production, stems from taking a festival designed for a single Viking hall and scaling it to billions of people across the global economy. Here's what should disturb you. We're following a Viking survival protocol designed for people trapped together by winter darkness, who needed elaborate ritual to prevent violence and despair during forced proximity. We've retained the mandatory quality, the family gathering requirement, the gift exchange obligations, the feast expectations, all the structure of a survival ritual, and applied it to modern contexts where these elements are not just unnecessary but often counterproductive. We've made what was practical psychological maintenance into commercial spectacle and social obligation, turning Viking winter survival into an annual stress festival that many people dread rather than enjoy. Yet we cannot opt out because the cultural programming is too deep, the judgment for non-participation too severe. We're still Vikings trying to make it through winter darkness together, except now we have electric lights, and the internet and abundant food and climate control. And we're doing the survival ritual anyway, bankrupting ourselves and stressing our families and damaging the environment to follow rules designed for a world of frozen darkness, where the alternative was cabin fever violence. That's how thoroughly Viking seasonal logic has colonized our calendar. We've made their winter survival necessary into our winter celebration mandatory, and we defend it as tradition and togetherness, when it's really just fear of what might happen if we stopped performing the ritual that kept them from killing each other during the long dark. And so, dear listener, we've journeyed through 25 aspects of modern life, 25 rules and rituals and assumptions that govern our behaviour, that shape our judgments, that structure our very understanding of what it means to be human in society. What have we discovered? That the week you structure your life around is a prayer calendar to gods you don't worship, that the handshake you offer in greeting is a weapon-checking protocol from an age of constant violence, that the ring you wear or don't wear, the toasts you make, the wood you knock, the way you name yourself and your children, all of these carry the weight of Viking decisions made for Viking reasons in a Viking world that vanished 1,000 years ago. We've seen how deeply these patterns run, how they shape everything from how we court romantic partners to how we judge people's cleanliness, from how we structure work to how we treat the elderly, from how we bury our dead to how we celebrate winter. The Vikings are not gone. They live in every gesture we make, every assumption we hold, every rule we follow without questioning. They built a world and we are still living in it, still obeying its logic, still performing its rituals, often with no idea that we're doing so. The natural question, perhaps, is whether this is good or bad, whether we should celebrate these continuities or work to escape them. But such questions assume a degree of choice that may not exist. Cultural patterns, once established, have their own momentum, their own power to persist. We cannot simply decide to stop following these rules, any more than we can decide to stop speaking the language we learned in childhood. The rules are embedded too deeply, too thoroughly, in the infrastructure of our social world. They shape our laws, our institutions, our expectations, our emotional responses to deviation. They are the water we swim in, invisible until someone points them out, and visible still remaining nearly impossible to escape. What we can do, perhaps, is recognise the arbitrariness. When we feel that surge of judgment towards someone who doesn't shake hands properly, who doesn't follow proper gift-giving protocols, who structures their life differently than the Viking rules prescribe, we can pause and ask whether our judgment reflects anything real or is simply the ghost of Scandinavian warriors punishing deviation from their survival strategies. When we feel pressure to follow rules that make us unhappy, to structure our lives around assumptions that don't serve us, we can recognise that pressure as historical rather than natural, as cultural rather than inevitable. We might not be able to fully escape the Viking framework, but we can at least stop treating it as though it were nature, as though it were the only possible way to organise human society, as though deviations were wrong rather than simply different. The Vikings solved their problems, developed their strategies, built their cultural framework to address challenges specific to their time, their place, their circumstances. They were remarkably successful enough that their solutions spread across continents, successful enough that we're still using them a millennium later. But their success in their context does not mean their rules are optimal for ours, and our continued obedience to those rules, despite changed circumstances, is not wisdom, but rather the powerful inertia of culture, the difficulty of imagining alternatives to frameworks we've never questioned. So the next time you check your calendar and see Wednesday, the next time you shake someone's hand in greeting, the next time you toast before drinking or knock on wood for luck, the next time you follow any of the hundreds of small rules and rituals that structure your daily life, perhaps you might pause and wonder, am I doing this because it serves me, or am I doing this because a Viking would have done it, and their world has shaped mine in ways I cannot fully escape? And in that pause, in that moment of recognition, perhaps there is a small freedom, not the freedom to completely remake yourself or your society, but the freedom to see the bars of the cage, to understand that what feels natural and inevitable is actually historical and contingent, and to choose, where choice is possible, to follow rules that serve your life rather than rules that serve theirs. I want to thank you, dear listener, for spending this time exploring these uncomfortable truths, these invisible inheritances. It is not always pleasant to recognise how thoroughly our autonomy is constrained by choices made by people long dead. How many of our convictions about what's natural and right are actually just fossilised strategies from a different world. There is something unsettling about realising that you are, in some sense, still living in the Viking age, still following their playbook, still dancing to music that was written before your great-great-great-grandparents were born. But there is also something valuable in this recognition, something that might, in time, grant you a kind of freedom. When you understand that the rules are arbitrary, that they were made by humans for human purposes that no longer apply, you gain the possibility of questioning them, of perhaps even changing them, or at least of choosing more consciously which ones you'll follow and which ones you'll resist. You might still follow most of them. The weight of culture is heavy, and individual resistance achieves little against such massive inertia. But you'll follow them with awareness rather than blind obedience, and that awareness is worth something. As you settle into sleep tonight, I hope you'll carry with you not distress about these discoveries, but rather a kind of gentle curiosity about the world you inhabit, about the rules you follow, about the frameworks that shape your perception and behaviour. Tomorrow you'll wake and likely follow most of these same rules again. You'll structure your day around a week named for gods you don't believe in. You'll probably shake hands with someone, knock on wood, perform a dozen Viking rituals without thinking about it. And that's fine. That's human. We are creatures of culture, and culture is always historical, always carrying forward more than we intend, always haunted by ghosts we cannot fully exorcise. But perhaps now, when you perform these rituals, some small part of you will remember where they came from, will recognise them as Viking rules we still follow for no reason, and in that recognition will be a tiny seed of freedom, of awareness, of the possibility that we might someday, collectively, build a world less constrained by the dead, less governed by strategies designed for circumstances we no longer face. Until then, we live in the world we've inherited. We follow the rules we've been taught. We move through the structures built by people who have been dust for 1,000 years. And there is a strange beauty in that too, a connection to the deep past, a recognition that we are part of a human story much larger and longer than our individual lives. That the Vikings who shaped these rules were people like us, trying to solve their problems, trying to survive, trying to build something that would last. They succeeded beyond their imagining. Their solutions became so successful that we cannot escape them. We are their heirs, whether we want to be or not, and we carry their world within us, in every gesture, every judgment, every unexamined assumption. So sleep well, dear listener, knowing that you are part of this long story, this transmission of culture across vast stretches of time, this process by which the past shapes the present in ways we can barely see. Sleep well, and perhaps dream of a different world, a world where we choose our rules consciously, rather than inheriting them unconsciously, where we build structures that serve our needs, rather than following structures designed for very different lives. That world may never fully arrive, but the dream of it is worth having, and the awareness that makes such dreams possible is worth cultivating, even as we continue, day after day, to follow Viking rules for no reason at all. Picture, if you will, for one final time tonight, a Viking ship on a calm northern sea, the kind of vessel that carried these people and their ideas across vast distances, that spread their culture from Scandinavia to Iceland to Greenland to the shores of North America, to the British Isles and deep into continental Europe, to Russia and Constantinople and places whose names we've forgotten. The ship moves steadily, powered by oars and sail, carrying cargo both physical and cultural, both visible and invisible. The physical cargo, the weapons and tools and trade goods that has long since rusted away, dissolved into the earth, lost to time. But the invisible cargo, the ideas and rules and assumptions those have sailed on, have reached shores the Vikings never imagined, have travelled into a future where longships are museum curiosities, but where the cultural technology those ships carried still governs billions of lives. You are the distant shore that ship was sailing toward. You are the heir to that invisible cargo. The Vikings are your ancestors, not necessarily in blood, but definitely in culture, in the frameworks that shape your thought, in the rules that govern your behaviour. They have been speaking to you your entire life, whispering in your ear about how to structure time, how to greet strangers, how to prove loyalty, how to mark status, how to survive winter, how to bury the dead. You have been listening, have been obeying, have been following their instructions encoded in language and gesture and ritual and law. And now, perhaps, you can begin to hear the voices clearly, can recognise them for what they are. Not nature, not universal truth, not the way things must be, but simply one group of human solutions to their problems, solutions so successful that they outlived their creators by a millennium and still govern the lives of people who have never heard of the Thing Assembly, or the Hamminger, or the Drauga, or the dozens of concepts that made these rules make sense in their original context. Let that recognition settle over you now, gently, without urgency, like snow falling on a quiet landscape. You're not required to do anything with this knowledge. You're not required to rebel against these rules, or to embrace them more consciously. You're simply invited to see them, to recognize them, to understand that they exist, that they shape you, that they are historical rather than natural. And in that seeing, perhaps, is a small freedom. The freedom of awareness, the freedom of recognizing the invisible structures that constrain and enable your life. The snow continues to fall in this image, soft and steady, covering the landscape in white, obscuring the details, making everything quiet and simple and peaceful. Your breathing has perhaps slowed as you've listened, your body relaxing, your mind drifting towards sleep. This is good. This is the natural end of this journey. You have spent these hours learning about the rules you follow, about the Viking world that still shapes yours, about the ways the past haunts the present. You have done the work of awareness. Now it is time to rest, to let these ideas settle into your subconscious, to allow sleep to process and integrate what you've learned. So let yourself drift now, gently, easily, knowing that tomorrow you will wake in a world shaped by Vikings, that you will follow their rules, that you will be their heir, and that this is simply the nature of being human in history, of living in a cultural stream that flows from the deep past toward an unknowable future, carrying us all along whether we recognize it or not. Rest well, dear listener. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. If you enjoyed this journey into the uncomfortable corners of cultural history, you might consider subscribing for more gentle examinations of the rules we follow without knowing why. But for now, simply rest. Let the Viking ship sail on, let the snow continue to fall, let your mind settle into the quiet space between waking and sleep. You have learned enough for one night. The rules will still be there tomorrow, waiting to shape your behaviour, waiting to prove that the Vikings never really left, that they live on in you, in me, in all of us, ghosts made of habit and assumption and unexamined tradition. But tonight, let the ghost rest too. Let everything rest. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of a story much larger than yourself, that you carry history within you, that the past and present are not separate but intertwined, and that in understanding this you have gained something valuable, even if you're not quite sure yet what that something is. Good night, dear listener. Good night.